Welcome to a journey through time where history isn't just a memory, but a vivid landscape of events and emotions waiting to be explored anew. Imagine stepping into the heart of a bustling medieval town, the ground beneath your feet uneven and worn with the sounds of horses' hooves clopping against cobblestones and the clinking of iron armor echoing in the air. There's a lively, almost chaotic energy around you villagers in simple yet functional garments, while the higher ups strut around in layers upon layers of elaborate cloths and accessories. The scent of fresh bread mingles with the less than pleasant smell of wet wool and the unmistakable aroma of horse dung. It's the kind of scene you can practically hear, taste, and smell, isn't it? And then there's the fashion. You're probably thinking it's just old clothes, right? But in the medieval world, clothing wasn't just about keeping warm or covering up. It was a statement. A statement that could be at times baffling, eccentric, and even downright bizarre. You could walk into a medieval street and spot a nobleman from a mile away by the elaborate and sometimes impractical details of his attire. Every item from the pointy shoes to the fur-lined capes had significance, telling the world not only who you were, but what you stood for. You probably won't survive this well, not without some serious discomfort anyway. Because medieval fashion wasn't about comfort. In fact, it often seemed to defy logic and reason in favor of excess, and let's face it, the oddball look of it all. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, post your location and local time. I'm curious where in the world you're tuning in from and whether medieval fashion was quite as out there in your neck of the woods. Wherever you are, I hope tonight brings you rest, comfort, and maybe a curious dream or two. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. Now, as we step further into this medieval wonderland, let's rewind to the early days of the Middle Ages. Back then, fashion wasn't nearly as outlandish. In the aftermath of the fall of the Roman Empire, people weren't exactly concerned with making grand sartorial statements. They were focused on survival. The first few centuries of the medieval era were all about functionality. If you could find clothing that kept you warm and covered, you were ahead of the game. Life was tough and practicality ruled. The early medieval wardrobe was quite frankly a far cry from the over-the-top fashion we've come to associate with this period. But as society began to stabilize and the upper classes gained more power and wealth, things started to change. Suddenly, people had the time, the resources, and most importantly, the desire to look, well, extra. The more fabric, the more color, the more layers, the better. You see, the concept of clothing as a status symbol began to evolve. Fashion was no longer just for protection or modesty, it became a competitive sport. Nobles and royalty alike would push the boundaries of what was considered normal in the name of fashion. Historians still argue whether the extravagant clothing of medieval nobles was simply a matter of self-expression, or if it was a deliberate attempt to emphasize the stark social hierarchy. Whatever the case, by the high Middle Ages, fashion had transformed into an art form, one that was as impractical as it was spectacular. One of the earliest signs that fashion was evolving came with the introduction of tailored clothing. Prior to the Middle Ages, most garments were simple tunics and cloaks that were cut in basic loose shapes. But as we moved further into the medieval period, the nobility began to demand more fitted, personalized garments. This shift allowed for more intricate designs and a greater emphasis on luxury fabrics like silk, brocade, and velvet. This new form of fashion had less to do with practicality and more to do with showing off. You could argue that the medieval obsession with fashion was driven by the need to display wealth, but there was also a deeper, more symbolic meaning behind it. The clothes you wore said everything about your rank, your lineage, and even your political power. If you were a wealthy merchant or noble, your clothes were a reflection of your status and a way to broadcast your influence. And if you were poor, well, you were stuck with whatever you could afford, likely wool or linen, which, while functional, were far less flashy. As the Middle Ages wore on and the power of the church began to influence more and more aspects of daily life, the relationship between clothing and religion became strained. While the church initially encouraged modesty, it also had to recognize the rising power of the nobility and their need to maintain appearances. This led to a complex dance between the world of fashion and the ideals of religious humility. The result, a bizarre mix of outrageous, ostentatious fashion that somehow managed to coexist with religious principles of modesty and restraint. It was, in a sense, a time of sartorial rebellion against the very ideals that guided the period. Let's not forget the oddities that came with medieval fashion. Many of the trends that would go on to define the period would seem out of place today. Things like those infamous pointed shoes which could stretch so long that they became almost unwearable. These shoes, known as poulaines, were initially a symbol of the upper class. The longer the point, the wealthier and more fashionable the wearer. Imagine trying to walk in shoes with toes that could rival the length of a small child's arm. It was all about excess, and you'd have to wonder how far could fashion really go before practicality had enough. The codpiece is another example of medieval fashion that defied both logic and comfort. A strange and often humorous addition to men's clothing, the codpiece was a padded piece of fabric or leather worn over the groin. It wasn't just for warmth, though. It became a symbol of masculinity and virility. At the height of its popularity, these padded garments were often embroidered or adorned with intricate designs, making them as much a fashion statement as a functional piece of clothing. And if you thought these men were all about practicality, think again, some cod pieces were so exaggerated they became a spectacle. As we take a step back and look at these early signs of medieval fashion, it becomes clear that clothing during this time was not just about warmth or protection. It was about making a statement. It was a game of power, status, and sometimes even sheer absurdity. But this was only the beginning. As we continue this journey through the medieval wardrobe, we'll dive deeper into these bizarre trends, uncovering the stories behind them, and perhaps even discovering why they were so absurdly popular. And remember, no matter how strange it seems, fashion is never really about what's practical. It's about pushing boundaries. And in the Middle Ages, they certainly knew how to push them. Now that we've begun to understand the eccentricities of medieval fashion, let's take a closer look at the beginning of this transformation. The Dark Ages, often seen as a period of cultural stagnation, was the backdrop for the birth of medieval fashion, which had to evolve from the ruins of the Roman Empire. During this time, clothing was quite functional, designed primarily for warmth, protection, and practicality. People wore simple tunics, cloaks, and sandals, nothing too extravagant. But as Europe moved into the early Middle Ages and society began to rebuild itself, something strange began to happen. Clothing slowly became more about status and symbolism than just mere protection. Early medieval fashion was rooted in necessity. There was little to no emphasis on style, as most people didn't have the luxury of thinking about anything other than survival. But as the feudal system took hold, the nobility grew in power, and so did their wardrobes. The more land you owned, the more clothing you needed to showcase your status. And it was the upper classes who were quick to embrace the shift, using fashion as a way to flaunt their wealth. This shift didn't happen overnight, though. Initially, medieval fashion was relatively simple. Most people wore woolen tunics, leather belts, and sandals made of coarse materials. There were no fancy accessories or intricate designs, just functional clothing. But over time, as the influence of the church waned in some areas and trade routes flourished, the medieval wardrobe began to evolve. Trade brought new fabrics like silks from the East, and with that, a new class of luxury items entered the picture. The idea of tailoring started to gain popularity. Before this period, clothing was cut in loose draped styles, but tailored garments were now in demand. The nobility wanted their clothes to fit better, to be more flattering, and to reflect their newfound wealth. This is where things start to get interesting. Tailored clothing allowed for more form-fitting, detailed designs. Suddenly, garments were no longer just about warmth, they were about showing off. And as you might guess, once fashion became about showing off, it didn't take long for it to become outrageous. Historians still debate whether the elaborate nature of these clothes was simply an expression of personal wealth, or whether it was also a deliberate attempt to distance the nobility from the common folk. After all, what better way to reinforce a social divide than through clothing that the average person couldn't afford? In this way, fashion became more than just a trend. It became a tool for maintaining the hierarchy. But even with the rise of wealthy tailored clothing, it wasn't all smooth sailing for fashion. As we'll see, the influence of the church played a huge role in how people dressed. For many centuries, the Catholic Church had a significant hold over daily life, including the clothes people wore. Religious authorities often condemned extravagant dress, urging followers to dress modestly in line with Christian ideals of humility and restraint. That didn't stop people from pushing the limits, though. In fact, fashion in the medieval era often outraged the church. For example, the excessive length of pointed shoes, which were a hallmark of noble fashion, came under fire from church leaders. These shoes, known as poulaines, were pointy at the toes, and the longer the point, the more wealth and status they symbolized. But these extravagant shoes were more than just a bit of a fashion statement. They were actually impractical and dangerous. Imagine trying to walk in shoes with long, awkward points extending far past your toes. It wasn't exactly built for speed or comfort. At one point, the church issued decrees against the overly extravagant footwear, saying that the excessively pointed shoes were ungodly. But the nobles, ever determined to assert their wealth, simply doubled down. They didn't just keep wearing these pointy shoes, they made them even more extreme. Some poulaines were so long they were tied to the wearer's knees to keep them from tripping over the points. Talk about dedication to a fashion trend. And it's here that we begin to see the intersection of practicality, absurdity, and social signaling. Pointed shoes weren't the only bizarre fashion trend to arise during this period. Another staple of medieval nobility was the codpiece, an item of clothing that's difficult to ignore. This piece of clothing worn by men was essentially a padded garment that covered the groin area. In the 15th century, the codpiece became not only a practical way to cover a man's most intimate area, but also a statement of masculinity. But what really set the codpiece apart was the extreme lengths to which some nobles went to make them larger, more prominent, and even more elaborate. Some codpieces were padded to the point that they practically turned the wearer into a walking joke, with exaggerated proportions that seemed to say, "I have wealth and I have something to prove." Embroidered with elaborate designs, sometimes even with gold or jewels, the codpiece became as much a symbol of wealth as it was of virility. Think of it as the medieval equivalent of a peacock, strutting about showing off its feathers, only the feathers were, well, much more personal. The codpiece wasn't just about status, it also came to represent ideas of power and masculinity. After all, the more extreme the codpiece, the more attention it drew, and attention meant power. The size and decoration of the codpiece spoke volumes about the wearer's social standing. his masculinity, and his ability to command attention. But what made the codpiece truly absurd was how it evolved over time. As the 16th century approached, codpieces grew even more extreme, taking on a life of their own. For a while, they were so pronounced that they practically became the focal point of a man's outfit. They were often used to emphasize physical strength or sexual prowess, which was deeply tied to the era's ideas of masculinity. But by the end of the 16th century, the codpiece began to fade, and with it the fashion for exaggerated masculinity. Fashion in the medieval world wasn't simply a matter of getting dressed, it was a full-fledged spectacle. The clothing people wore was often a direct reflection of their social status, their wealth, and their desire to outdo one another. And as strange as these fashion trends may seem, they were essential for the time. Fashion was a game and only the rich could afford to play. As we continue to explore medieval fashion, we'll dive deeper into how these bizarre trends became iconic and defined the era. What might seem impractical, excessive, and downright ridiculous to us today was in many ways an essential part of the medieval identity. And while it might be tempting to laugh at these trends, the reality is that medieval fashion was in its own right ahead of its time, and maybe a little bit too ahead. Now that we've established how medieval fashion was deeply entangled with status and wealth, let's dive into some of the most iconic and bizarre trends that came to define the era. You've probably heard of the extravagant ruff collars, which were at one point the epitome of high society. These frilly, lace-edged collars were worn by both men and women in the 16th century, and while they may have looked delicate and beautiful, they were in fact incredibly impractical. Picture yourself at a medieval banquet. You're sitting at a long, candlelit table surrounded by the elite, their faces framed by massive, stiff ruffs. They're so large and starched that they could barely turn their heads without causing a scene. In fact, many people struggled with basic movements, turning their heads, eating, or even drinking. But it wasn't about comfort, it was about appearing to have enough wealth to afford these cumbersome accessories, which were often made from fine lace or linen, sometimes even adorned with precious stones. Imagine wearing something so bulky that it hindered your ability to enjoy the banquet you were throwing in the first place. Talk about dedication to fashion. Historians still debate the full reason behind the ruff's popularity. Some argue that it was a symbol of sophistication and elegance, while others suggest it was part of a wider trend where fashion became more about exaggeration and spectacle. In fact, some historians claim that the ruff was a form of rebellion against the simple styles that had dominated the early Renaissance. The more extravagant the ruff, the more it reflected the wearer's ability to defy practicality in the name of fashion. And let's not forget, ruff collars weren't just for the elite. As time went on, they were adopted by various classes, each adding their own flair. The more opulent the ruff, the higher the status of the wearer. But eventually, even these once fashionable ruffs fell out of style, their towering collars fading into the background of history. As absurd as these frilly collars were, they weren't alone in their over-the-top nature. Medieval fashion was built on excess and layers, and the gown, especially for women, was no exception. These garments could reach ridiculous lengths, flowing far past the wearer's feet, trailing behind them like a living, breathing cloud of fabric. And what's worse, the longer the gown, the more it signified your wealth and status. The average person couldn't afford such voluminous clothing, but for those who could, the length of the gown was practically a competition. Train gowns, as they were called, could drag on for several feet, and you had to have attendants just to help you carry them around. Women would need help not only to walk, but to sit and stand, as the gown could make movement incredibly cumbersome. Can you imagine what it would be like to navigate through crowded streets or even sit at a banquet table in a gown so long that it took several people just to help manage the fabric. It's hard to believe that something so impractical could ever be fashionable, but again, it wasn't about practicality, it was about demonstrating just how wealthy you were. The gown was a symbol of the wearer's power and ability to command the resources needed to wear such an extravagant outfit. And if you were part of the nobility or royalty, you were expected to keep up with the trend. If you didn't, well, let's just say the social consequences were harsh. The fashion of long flowing gowns also extended to the men's wardrobe in a somewhat different form, specifically with the doublet. This tight-fitting jacket, which was often worn under a more flowing outer garment, had a much more structured militaristic feel than the gowns worn by women. Yet it was still part of the same trend of exaggerated clothing. Doublets were designed to accentuate the wearer's physique, often creating a silhouette that made the man appear broader, more powerful. But much like the gowns, doublets had to be of the highest quality material to signify status. In fact, many were heavily padded, or made with luxurious fabrics like velvet brocade or silk. The richer the material, the more valuable and by extension powerful the wearer appeared. It was as much about shape as it was about fabric. In addition to these garments, medieval fashion was full of quirky accessories that would baffle anyone who tried to wear them today. One such accessory was the hood. Now, hoods weren't anything new, they had been worn for centuries as practical clothing to protect against the elements. But in medieval fashion, the hood became more symbolic, often associated with rank. The nobility would wear elaborate hoods made from fine fabrics like velvet and fur, sometimes even adorned with precious metals or jewels. In many cases, these hoods were so large that they covered the wearer's entire head, leaving only their face visible. The hoods of the elite were often so over the top that they looked almost like crowns, with intricate decorations and luxurious materials that signified the wearer's wealth and social standing. But it wasn't just the noble classes who were getting in on the fashion game. As medieval society grew and the middle class began to emerge, people wanted to participate in these trends too. So what did they do? They adapted the fashion of the elites to their own budgets. The middle class would wear simpler versions of the same garments, often using cheaper fabrics, or avoiding the most extravagant accessories, but they still sought to replicate the overall appearance of the higher classes. This attempt to imitate the nobility's fashion became so widespread that it eventually led to what we now refer to as sumptuary laws. These laws were put in place by monarchs and the church to regulate what people could and couldn't wear based on their social status. They were designed to prevent the lower classes from imitating the upper classes too much, and also to maintain a clear visual divide between the two. For example, certain types of fur like ermine could only be worn by royalty. Similarly, sumptuary laws prohibited the common folk from wearing silk or jewels, ensuring that these luxury items remained the exclusive domain of the rich. The irony, of course, is that these very regulations fueled an even greater desire to display wealth through clothing. The more the elite tried to distance themselves from the lower classes, the more absurd and ostentatious their fashion became. Medieval fashion, as we can see, was an ongoing spectacle, one where luxury and excess reigned supreme. And yet, it wasn't just about looking good, it was about asserting dominance, about demonstrating power and wealth in the most flamboyant ways possible. What we might consider a bizarre or impractical fashion trend today was back then the height of sophistication. And as we continue to explore the most outlandish trends of the time, we'll uncover even more strange but fascinating examples of how fashion in the medieval world was about far more than just getting dressed. It was about creating an identity and at times a public performance. As we continue our journey through the bizarre world of medieval fashion, let's take a moment to appreciate one of the most curious and at times ridiculous trends that emerged during this period: the codpiece. Yes, you heard that correctly. The codpiece, often hailed as one of the most memorable and frankly absurd items of clothing in history, was a padded piece of cloth worn to cover a man's groin area. And no, it wasn't just a practical garment. It became a status symbol, an extravagant statement about masculinity, and at times the focal point of a man's entire outfit. While the codpiece had its origins in the need to protect and cover the male anatomy, it didn't stay practical for long. By the late 15th century, the codpiece had transformed into an exaggerated fashion statement, often elaborately padded and in some cases embellished with jewels, embroidery, or even gold. It wasn't just about modesty or utility anymore, it was about drawing attention. And as ridiculous as it sounds, people loved it. The history of the codpiece began as a practical addition to clothing. During the medieval period, men wore tight-fitting hose, and the codpiece served to cover the gap between the hose and their tunics. This was a necessary garment, but it soon became more than that. As fashion evolved and exaggerated silhouettes became the norm, the codpiece became a symbol of masculinity, virility, and wealth. The more voluminous the codpiece, the wealthier the wearer appeared. To have a large, well-padded codpiece meant that you had the resources to afford the finest fabrics and, perhaps more importantly, you had the power to flaunt it. Historians still argue whether the codpiece's prominence was entirely about masculinity, or whether it was a way for men to showcase their wealth and status. Some even speculate that it became a symbol of power, with the codpiece acting as a metaphorical weapon, a way for men to assert their dominance. Either way, the codpiece became huge both in terms of its physical size and its symbolic importance. The absurdity of the codpiece reached its peak in the 16th century. During this time, the codpiece became so exaggerated that it started to look more like a piece of armor than clothing. Some men wore codpieces so large that they had to be tied to their legs to keep them from dragging the wearer down. It wasn't uncommon for a codpiece to have actual padding that made it appear even larger than it already was, and at times it could resemble a grotesque, almost comical exaggeration of masculinity. Imagine walking into a room and the first thing that catches your eye isn't a person's face or clothing, but their codpiece. It was that striking. Interestingly, this trend was so widespread that it transcended just the nobility. Even men of the middle class began wearing codpieces in an attempt to emulate the elite. And it wasn't just for show. Many codpieces were lined with velvet or embroidered with intricate patterns, making them not just a fashion statement, but a work of art if you could get past the absurdity of it all. But what about the pointy shoes that we mentioned earlier, the poulains as they were called, were another oddity of medieval fashion that took fashion excess to a whole new level. These shoes with their absurdly long pointed toes became a symbol of high society during the 14th and 15th centuries. The longer the point, the more fashionable and powerful you appeared. In fact, some of these shoes had points so long that they had to be tied to the wearer's knees to prevent them from tripping. Can you imagine trying to walk with a pair of shoes that extended a good foot or more beyond your toes? Not exactly practical, is it? But practicality was never the point. Poulaines were about social standing and showing off your wealth. The longer the point of the shoe, the more money you had to spare. These shoes were often made from expensive leather, and sometimes the pointed toe was adorned with decorative features like gold or precious stones. And like the codpiece, poulain didn't just disappear after their peak. They evolved into a symbol of fashion and status carried on by the nobility, who couldn't resist making their footwear as eye-catching as possible. Historians still argue about how exactly these pointed shoes came to be. Some claim that they were inspired by the pointed shoes worn in the East, while others believe they were merely a local invention. Regardless of their origin, the poulens quickly became a must-have accessory for the medieval elite. And just like that, what started as a simple shoe turned into an indicator of wealth and social power. But these absurd fashion trends weren't confined to just clothing. Even hairstyles in the medieval world could be outrageous. Hair became another sign of social class, but unlike today's fashions, medieval hairstyles were often exaggerated to such a degree that they almost defied logic. Nobles and wealthy men often wore their hair long and flowing, while women took it to the next level, styling their hair in ways that involved intricate braids, curls, and elaborate headdresses. Some women even wore wigs to give the impression of having longer, fuller hair. Headdresses were sometimes made from metal adorned with jewels, or elaborately embroidered with thread. In fact, the more intricate your hairstyle or headdress, the higher your social standing. One of the most outlandish trends was the hennin, a tall, pointed headdress worn by women which looked almost like a cone or a steeple. These headdresses could reach great heights, and much like the poulens, the taller the hennin, the greater the status of the woman wearing it. Not only did the hennin give women an impressive look, but it also had the practical effect of making the wearer stand out in a crowd. But let's be real for a moment. While the hennin made a great fashion statement, it also made everyday activities incredibly difficult. You couldn't walk around comfortably in a hennin, let alone sit down. The sheer impracticality of wearing these tall, rigid headdresses was for many a minor inconvenience compared to the prestige they brought. As we continue down the rabbit hole of medieval fashion, we can see that these trends were more than just strange clothing choices. They were visual manifestations of power status and societal norms, carefully curated by the elite to separate themselves from the lower classes. And while it may seem ridiculous to us today, these fashion statements were serious business back then. Medieval fashion wasn't just about looking good, it was about reinforcing power and wealth. Whether it was the absurd codpiece, the extravagant ruff collar, or the towering hennin, these fashion choices were meant to signal one thing: I am different, I am powerful, and I have the resources to prove it. Let's continue exploring the wonders and, let's face it, wild world of medieval fashion. As we've seen, clothing was more than just a necessity, it was a tool for demonstrating power, wealth, and social status. But there were also trends that might seem strangely familiar to us today, albeit with a medieval twist. Take the girdle, for example. Now, this wasn't just any belt, it was an integral part of the medieval wardrobe, especially for those in the upper echelons of society. The girdle was a fancy belt, worn at the waist or just below the chest, often made of leather, silk, or embroidered cloth. But unlike your average belt, it was adorned with decorations, jewels, and even chains depending on the wearer's wealth. The purpose of the girdle was twofold: to keep garments in place, often to hold up heavy gowns, and to show off one's wealth and fashion sense. Girdles were frequently worn by both men and women, and in many cases they were designed to be as visually striking as possible. The more elaborately decorated the girdle, the greater the social status of the wearer. It's almost like medieval bling, only more elaborate and a lot harder to adjust. For men, the girdle wasn't just functional, it was also a symbol of authority. A well-crafted, jewel-encrusted girdle could elevate a man from being a mere nobleman to someone who had the clout to make a real impact in the courts. And let's not forget how the girdle also served as a weapon carrier in some cases. Nobles would hide small daggers or even ceremonial swords in their girdles as a way to symbolize their readiness for battle or political intrigue. Picture that your fashion accessory doubles as a concealed weapon. Only in the medieval world would you find someone strutting around in a jewel-encrusted belt while secretly packing heat. Now let's shift gears a bit and look at hairstyles, which were an equally extravagant form of self-expression during the medieval period. If you think your morning routine is complicated, try living in the Middle Ages where your hairstyle could determine not just your social class, but your political status as well. In fact, hairstyles were so important that people often spent hours, sometimes even days, creating intricate and sometimes absurd hairdos. Noblemen were often seen sporting elaborate haircuts, which ranged from long flowing locks to closely cropped styles. These haircuts weren't just about style, they were symbols of power and masculinity. But it wasn't just about haircuts. No, medieval nobles often wore wigs made from the finest materials. These wigs were made from human hair, horsehair, or even animal fur, depending on the wealth of the wearer. The wigs were often styled to appear as if the wearer had naturally long, voluminous hair, which was seen as a mark of nobility. But once again, this was all about one thing, creating the image of power and prestige. Women, too, were subject to similar pressures when it came to their hair. Medieval women spent an inordinate amount of time on their hairstyles, creating intricate braids, curls, and updos that would leave you questioning how they managed to even get out the door. But the most iconic of all was the hennin, that towering pointed headdress that women were often seen wearing in the 15th century. Now, you may have seen this style in historical dramas, but let me tell you, it wasn't just some random fashion statement. The hennin was a status symbol, and a very extreme one at that. The hennin itself was designed to make the wearer appear taller, more regal, and more imposing. In some cases, these headpieces could reach such heights that they were considered outrageously impractical. It wasn't uncommon for women to need help just to get around while wearing them. Imagine trying to navigate a room full of people only to have your hennin scrape against the walls or knock over a nearby candle. And don't even get me started on the wind one gust and you could find yourself face down in a puddle. But let's not dismiss these trends too quickly because there was a method to the madness. These fashion choices were driven by one thing: visibility. The taller the hennin, the more people could see you from afar. It's almost like medieval fashion's answer to standing on a soapbox in the town square demanding attention. The higher the headdress, the more powerful the person appeared. It was all about making a statement, and in some cases creating a lasting image of wealth and influence. Another hairstyle that caught on in medieval Europe was the coif, a simple yet practical head covering worn by both men and women. The coif was a snug-fitting cap made of linen or wool that was worn under other headpieces or alone. In the medieval period, the coif had a significant role. It was often a sign of one's status, especially among the common people. If you were wearing a finely made coif adorned with lace or embroidery, you were likely of noble birth. But if you wore a plain, simple coif, well, then you were probably just a commoner. No frills, no frills. But despite all the extravagance in medieval fashion, it's interesting to note that even in a world obsessed with luxury practicality, still managed to find its way into clothing choices. For instance, tights. Something we associate with modern fashion were a staple in medieval wardrobes, particularly in the late medieval period. Initially worn for warmth, tights evolved into a fashionable item often designed to match the wearer's outfit and made from rich fabrics like silk or velvet. And while they weren't always seen as the most glamorous item of clothing, they did serve an important function in medieval society. They provided warmth and coverage while maintaining the illusion of wealth. Men and women alike wore tights to cover their legs, and these garments were often brightly colored, adding a bit of flair to what would otherwise be a simple utilitarian item. As fashion continued to evolve, tights became an essential part of the noble wardrobe, worn beneath doublets or gowns. And as odd as it might seem, the tights of the medieval world were a necessary accessory for those who wanted to keep up with the high fashion trends of the time. What we can conclude from all this is that medieval fashion was a complex mix of extremes, extravagant accessories, impractical garments, and extravagant displays of power and status. Whether it was the towering hennin, the exaggerated codpiece, or the jewel-encrusted girdle, each item of clothing had one purpose: to demonstrate the wearer's wealth, influence, and power. And while it may seem bizarre by modern standards, the truth is that medieval fashion was a reflection of the societal norms and values of the time. It was about visibility, power, and in many cases a commitment to sheer absurdity. As we wrap up our exploration of these odd trends, we can see that medieval fashion wasn't just a passing whim, it was an essential part of social life, a way of performing one's identity for all to see. And in the end, the more extravagant your wardrobe, the more you stood out as someone who commanded attention. It's safe to say that the medieval world, when it came to fashion, was anything but boring. As we move deeper into the eccentric world of medieval fashion, let's focus on a truly fascinating aspect: colors. Now, you might think of medieval fashion as being all browns, grays, and dull earth tones, but that couldn't be further from the truth. The colors of medieval clothing were actually a huge indicator of one's social class, wealth, and power. But this was a time when achieving vibrant colors required immense effort and often came at a cost. If you were a noble, the brighter and more vibrant the colors, the more power and influence you appeared to have. For instance, purple was one of the most coveted colors of all, but it wasn't just because it looked regal. Purple dye came from a species of sea snail known as the murex, and extracting it was a painstaking and costly process. To produce even a small amount of purple dye required harvesting thousands of snails, which made it incredibly expensive. The result, purple became a color almost exclusively reserved for royalty. It was so associated with wealth and nobility that sumptuary laws, the same laws that controlled who could wear what, often forbade common folk from wearing anything remotely purple. If you weren't a member of the royal family or a high-ranking noble, you could forget about wearing purple, but it wasn't just purple. Gold was another color that signified wealth and status in medieval fashion. And unlike today's shiny metallic gold, medieval gold was often found in the form of rich golden threads woven into garments, or used in embellishments like gold leaf or golden embroidery. These golden details often adorn the sleeves, hems, and collars of the wealthiest garments, shimmering in the light and drawing attention to the wearer's high rank. What's truly fascinating, though, is how the use of color was about much more than just appearance. In many cases, colors had deep symbolic meanings. Red, for example, was often associated with power and passion. It was worn by the nobility to convey their strength and influence, especially in the context of ceremonial attire. But it wasn't just for the elite. Red was also used to symbolize martyrdom and sacrifice, which is why clergy members and saints were often depicted wearing red robes in religious art. Blue, on the other hand, had an entirely different significance. Although it was also a noble color, it was closely tied to the Virgin Mary and was thus seen as a deeply spiritual and purifying color. Blue became one of the most expensive colors to produce as it came from a plant known as woad, and the process of extracting the dye was both difficult and time-consuming. It wasn't until the 15th century that blue was made more widely available, and even then it was often a color reserved for the wealthy and the devout. And as for black, well, black was the ultimate sign of sophistication in late medieval fashion. It was often worn by the wealthiest men and women to symbolize not just nobility, but also elegance and seriousness. Of course, the common folk couldn't afford such luxury, so they wore more modest colors like browns, yellows, and pale reds. Their clothing wasn't designed to make a bold fashion statement, it was meant to serve as a functional everyday garment. But for those in the upper classes, their garments were walking statements of their social and political power, and colors were one of the most significant ways of achieving that. But don't think the elite were the only ones obsessed with color. While the common people may not have had access to the most expensive dyes, they were still incredibly resourceful in their own right. They used plants, fruits, and even insects to create their own dyes, and this led to an amazing array of colors and patterns in their garments. The lower classes couldn't wear the flashy purple or royal gold, but their clothes could still be rich in color and texture, often dyed with locally available materials like berries, tree bark, and even weeds. Of course, as time went on, the desire to wear the most extravagant colors led to some rather absurd fashion choices. As more people became obsessed with keeping up with the latest fashion trends, the idea of excess in clothing began to creep into the everyday wardrobe of the elite. From color-drenched gowns and tunics to brightly feathered hats and gloves, medieval fashion became an intense competition to see who could outdo everyone else. And in this race to display wealth, power, and status, the concept of tasteful simplicity was thrown completely out the window. Speaking of hats now, there's another fascinating aspect of medieval fashion. Just like the codpiece and poulain hats were often used as a way to signal social class and rank. The more ornate and extravagant the hat, the more wealth you were thought to have. Let's take the chaperon, a type of hooded cloak or headdress that became incredibly popular in the late Middle Ages. The chaperon was often worn by both men and women, but it became a particularly fashionable accessory for men in the 14th century. The chaperon was an intricate layered headpiece that was made up of a soft hood, a cloth band, and a long, flowing fabric tail that could be arranged into elaborate shapes. The more luxurious the fabric used, the higher the status of the wearer. And while it may sound somewhat tame, the truth is that chaperons could be incredibly elaborate and eccentric. In fact, some men would wear the fabric so long that they'd have to wrap it around their shoulders or even drape it over their arms like a flowing scarf. In certain cases, chaperons were designed to be so long and dramatic that they could become tangled with other accessories, creating a style of headwear that was as much of a spectacle as it was a statement. But the most ridiculous aspect of the chaperon and of medieval hats in general was the fact that some of them were designed to be so unwieldy and outlandish that they practically became a performance in themselves. Take the fool's cap, a hat worn by jesters and entertainers. This hat had multiple floppy tails and often featured exaggerated points or bright colors. It was meant to draw attention and highlight the wearer's playful comic nature. In a world where hats were one of the most important aspects of fashion, the fool's cap stood as a symbol of how fashion could serve both as a statement of power and an expression of one's identity. And here's the kicker. While people were dressing to impress and displaying their wealth through the absurdity of their fashion choices, they were doing it all under the constant gaze of religion. The Catholic Church, which held significant sway during the medieval period, had a complex relationship with fashion. On one hand, the Church was deeply concerned with modesty, urging people to cover themselves in a humble and simple manner. On the other hand, the Church also recognized the importance of visual spectacle and ritual, two things that fashion delivered in abundance. Medieval fashion, with all its eccentricities, was an art of balance between displaying wealth and appeasing religious norms, between outlandish excess and controlled modesty. But as we've seen, the medieval world was a place where excess reigned supreme, and people found ways to make their clothing as spectacular and sometimes as ridiculous as possible. It was a world where a simple garment could speak volumes about who you were and where you stood in the social hierarchy. As we journey through the world of medieval fashion, it's hard not to marvel at how extravagant and excessive the trends became. But it wasn't just the nobility who took fashion to such extreme lengths. Even the common folk found ways to embrace the changing styles, albeit with simpler and more affordable materials. And while they might not have been able to wear the latest purple-dyed velvet tunics or codpieces adorned with jewels, they still had their own way of making a statement. Take tights, for example. In today's world, tights are an everyday clothing item that you probably don't think twice about, but in the medieval period, tights were a luxury. Initially designed for warmth, they quickly became a fashionable accessory worn by both men and women. While the upper classes wore tights made of expensive silks, the common folk had to make do with wool or linen. But even so, tights had a certain allure that made them a key piece in medieval fashion. For men, tights were often worn under their tunics, peeking out from underneath elaborate coats or gowns. For women, tights were a part of the undergarment set, layered beneath long gowns. But as time went on, tights began to evolve from a purely functional item to a statement piece in its own right. The more elaborate the tights, the higher the wearer's social standing. Some nobles even had their tights embroidered with intricate patterns or decorated with beads and jewels, further enhancing their look. But even when the common folk wore tights, it wasn't about practicality or warmth anymore. Tights were now a display of individuality, a chance to stand out, even if you didn't have the resources to keep up with the elite's most outlandish trends. Still, this obsession with fashion wasn't limited to just tights and tunics. Every piece of clothing became an opportunity for nobles to outdo one another in a public display of power and wealth. One of the most intriguing aspects of medieval fashion was the introduction of sumptuary laws, which were laws designed to regulate what people could wear based on their social status. These laws were a clear indication of how important clothing was as a marker of identity. If you were a nobleman, you could wear rich fabrics like velvet and silk, but you couldn't wear them too extravagantly. The laws would dictate how much fur jewelry and precious metals could be used in clothing. And for the peasants, they had a strict limit on what they could wear with the intention of preserving the stark visual divide between classes. For example, common folk could wear wool and linen but were forbidden from wearing the most luxurious fabrics. Historians still debate the true effectiveness of these sumptuary laws. Were they truly meant to preserve the social hierarchy, or were they simply a means for rulers to control the growing wealth of the emerging merchant class? Some argue that these laws were mostly symbolic, designed to remind people of their place in society. Others believe that they were more practical. There were, after all, many instances of fashion-induced conflicts where the rich and the poor clashed over clothing styles. Regardless of their intent, these laws helped reinforce the rigid boundaries between social classes that defined medieval society. But as we delve into this complex relationship between fashion and class, it's impossible not to notice how absurd some of these trends must have seemed, even to the people who wore them. Consider the long sleeves that were so exaggerated in some garments that they were practically trailing on the ground. These long sleeves were worn by both men and women and were often made from the finest fabrics decorated with elaborate embroidery. In many cases, the sleeves were so long that they became part of the spectacle trailing behind the wearer as they walked, requiring attendants to help manage the fabric. These sleeves were a status symbol, and the longer the sleeve, the more prestigious the wearer appeared. But imagine trying to get through a crowded market or navigate a winding staircase while dragging these long, cumbersome sleeves behind you. It would have been almost impossible without assistance. Then there was the trend for wide shoulders, a look that many of the medieval nobility sought to achieve with their garments. This was often accomplished through the use of padded shoulders or the layering of fabrics that made the wearer's upper body look larger. Much like the long sleeves, wide shoulders were a sign of wealth and status, but they were also a bit ridiculous. The wider the shoulders, the more exaggerated the silhouette and the more power the person was trying to project. This obsession with exaggerated proportions wasn't confined to shoulders and sleeves. The hoops and skirts worn by women in the 15th century also became ridiculously oversized. Women's gowns often featured hooped skirts that made their silhouettes resemble massive bell-shaped cones. These garments were so large that they required additional support from a network of petticoats and undergarments, and they became notorious for blocking doorways and requiring extra space. These enormous skirts weren't just for practical purposes. They were symbols of wealth, as only the wealthy had the space and resources to wear them. But what about fabrics? Medieval fashion was at its core about luxury textiles, and the most luxurious fabrics were the rarest and most expensive. Silk was perhaps the most coveted of all, coming from distant lands like China, and only the richest of the rich could afford it. Silk was used for everything from tunics and gowns to delicate accessories and ceremonial robes. But it wasn't just about the luxury fabric. The patterns on these silks were often intricately designed, telling stories or featuring symbols that reflected the wearer's power family or even political aspirations. On the opposite end of the fabric spectrum was wool, which, while inexpensive, was still heavily utilized in medieval fashion. Wool could be dyed in a variety of colors, and though it was far less luxurious than silk, it became the primary material for many of the working classes. But even wool was subject to the whims of fashion. Certain types of wool-carded wool, for example, were highly prized for their texture and durability, and nobles would often pay a premium for this particular fabric. But as we reach the end of the medieval period, there were signs that these exaggerated styles were beginning to fade. With the onset of the Renaissance, fashion began to shift toward a more naturalistic, less extreme silhouette. The excessive long sleeves, towering hennons, and codpieces eventually gave way to more tailored, practical clothing that was still luxurious but much less extravagant. The sumptuary laws that had once governed what people could wear were also relaxed, and fashion began to reflect more of the individuality and creativity that defined the Renaissance period. Looking back, it's hard not to laugh at the absurdity of medieval fashion. The codpieces, the poulaines, the ruffs, and the towering hennons, each one more ridiculous than the last, served as a constant reminder of how fashion can be a tool for signaling wealth and power. But despite how strange and impractical these fashions seem to us today, they were once the height of sophistication and elegance. And in the end, medieval fashion tells us just as much about the people who wore these bizarre clothes as it does about the society that demanded them. As we continue to peel back the layers of medieval fashion, it's time to focus on something just as essential and just as bizarre as the extravagant clothing, the accessories. Throughout the medieval period, accessories were far from being mere additions to an outfit. They were significant markers of status, wealth, and sometimes even political affiliation. If you thought the clothing itself was outlandish, Wait until you hear about the jewelry belts, gloves, and even the miraculous, if somewhat absurd, fashion of the pouch. Let's start with jewelry, which played a monumental role in medieval fashion. If you thought jewelry today was a symbol of wealth, you'd be spot on. But in the Middle Ages, it was much more than that. It was about power and identity. Gold rings, necklaces, and brooches were all highly coveted items, but they weren't just for personal adornment. They were for public demonstration. The wealthier you were, the more rings you wore, and often those rings were engraved with family crests, religious symbols, or gemstones that were meant to communicate not only your wealth but also your family's political influence. Think of a medieval engagement ring, but on steroids, a large over the top family heirloom that didn't just symbolize love but dynastic power and political alliances. One of the strangest pieces of jewelry worn in the medieval period was the brooch. While brooches were used to fasten garments or scarves in place, their designs went far beyond functionality. These decorative pins, often made of gold and adorned with precious stones, could be as large as the palm of your hand, featuring intricate scenes or symbols that told stories of the wearer's importance. These brooches weren't simply ornaments, they were like tiny billboards of status, broadcasting the wearer's affiliations and level of wealth. Picture a brooch as big as a dinner plate on the chest of a knight or royal. Could there be any clearer message that they were part of the elite? As for belts, they weren't just functional accessories either. Medieval belts were often richly decorated, made from leather or fabric, and adorned with metal clasps or buckles. A girdle, for example, could be a wide, embellished belt worn by both men and women, often featuring chains or pouches for carrying small, personal items like coins or tools. These weren't just everyday belts. They were an essential part of the look, often richly decorated with gems or intricate weaving. Sometimes the more elaborate the belt, the more the wearer was trying to convey a sense of readiness, whether for battle or for a lavish feast. But perhaps one of the most overlooked yet utterly fascinating accessories of the time was the pouch. Yes, pouches. These little bags were practically everywhere, hanging from the belts of both men and women. But don't think of them as mere carriers for coins or valuables. These pouches were a fashion statement in their own right. Often elaborately embroidered or crafted from luxurious materials like velvet or leather, pouches were a way to show off your attention to detail and your wealth. Some pouches even had gold clasps or were adorned with jewels. Picture a peasant wearing a modest pouch made of wool while a noblewoman sported a velvet pouch embroidered with pearls. What's fascinating about these pouches is that they didn't just carry valuables, they also held symbolic meaning. Some pouches were worn by knights to carry their emblems, others by women to hold their personal tokens. But what they really symbolized was an almost obsessive need to personalize one's outfit with an accessory that showed off both wealth and individuality. In a time when personal items were scarce, these pouches became an extension of a person's identity, woven into the very fabric of medieval society. But we can't forget the gloves. Medieval gloves are often made of luxury leather and embroidered with intricate patterns designed to protect the hands while also displaying wealth. While gloves might seem like a mundane item today in the medieval world, they were treated as a key accessory. Men and women alike wore them, sometimes adorned with precious stones and often given as gifts in the highest of courts. The more ornate the glove, the more wealth the wearer was perceived to have. If you were really wealthy, you'd often have gloves made specifically to match your outfit. And let's not forget ceremonial gloves, which were often exchanged during important events such as royal feasts or political meetings. In many cases, these gloves were embroidered with family crests, and their exchange could signify an alliance between families or kingdoms. Now let's take a step back and examine the medieval approach to headwear, which, as we've seen with the hennin, was often not just about practicality but about who you were and how much you mattered. A good example of this is the coif. The coif was a snug-fitting cap made of linen often worn under other headdresses or as a practical layer during colder months. It was a status symbol when made from fine fabrics, and it also functioned as a way to keep long hair in place. But the coif wasn't just functional, it was also deeply symbolic. In fact, the more elaborate the coif, the more the wearer's wealth could be inferred. However, some of the most notable headwear trends came in the form of crowns and diadems, which were worn by royalty or high-ranking nobles. These headpieces were often heavily adorned with precious stones or metals, and signified the highest levels of authority and privilege. Interestingly, crowns were not only limited to those at the very top of the social hierarchy. In fact, some medieval crowns were worn by bishops and abbots to symbolize their ecclesiastical power. The rich gold-drenched diadems weren't just for kings and queens, they were also visible markers of one's influence within the church or court. In addition to crowns, feathered hats made a big impact on medieval fashion. These large dramatic hats were often adorned with feathers, silk, and even precious stones. Worn by both men and women, they could be towering, asymmetrical creations that made the wearer stand out from the crowd. But these hats weren't just for attention. They were also meant to evoke a sense of grandeur and power. Much like the oversized ruffs, the taller and more decorated the hat, the more prestigious the wearer was. Medieval fashion, for all its bizarre and excessive elements, was at its core about visibility. Clothing, accessories, and headwear were all symbols of social status. Jewelry and pouches weren't just practical, they were markers of wealth and power. Gloves weren't mere protection for hands. They were an opportunity to display one's opulence. And even the coif, an item we would consider mundane today, was imbued with social significance. The more excessive the fashion, the greater the visual divide between the elite and the common folk. It wasn't enough to simply wear clothing, you had to wear clothing that told a story about who you were, where you came from, and your place in the world. In conclusion, medieval fashion wasn't just about covering up, it was a performative art. From the elaborate jewelry to the intricate pouches, every element of an outfit had the potential to signal wealth, power, and status. And while some of these trends may seem outlandish by modern standards, the meaning behind each fashion statement is clear. Medieval fashion was as much about politics, class, and social identity as it was about fabric and style. As we wrap up our exploration of medieval fashion, let's take a moment to reflect on just how deeply fashion was intertwined with medieval life. Clothing in the Middle Ages wasn't just a way to cover the body, it was a visual representation of social order, power, and identity. What you wore told the world not just who you were, but where you stood in the complex social hierarchy. And as absurd as some of these fashion trends may seem to us today, they were crucial parts of the medieval world, helping to reinforce power dynamics and define status in a society that placed great importance on appearances. But it wasn't just the extravagant garments and accessories that defined medieval fashion. It was also the materials. The fabrics used in clothing were often symbolic and highly regulated. The most expensive fabrics like silk, brocade, and velvet were reserved for the elite, while the working classes had to make do with wool and linen. And don't think that it was just the wealthy who wanted to wear these fine fabrics. The obsession with luxury and visual display was so ingrained in society that even the middle classes tried to replicate the look of the rich, albeit with less expensive materials. This desire to emulate the nobility often led to the passing of sumptuary laws, which were designed to regulate what different classes could and couldn't wear. thereby maintaining the strict social divisions. One of the most interesting aspects of medieval fashion, though, was how it evolved with political changes. Fashion wasn't just about individual style, it was a reflection of the shifting tides of power. As kings, queens, and nobles engaged in political maneuvering, their clothing choices often acted as a kind of nonverbal communication about their allegiances, their wealth, and their influence. For example, the use of fur in clothing wasn't just for warmth, it was often a symbol of royalty and privilege. The fur-lined capes worn by royalty in the medieval period were sometimes made from the pelts of exotic animals that were only available to the wealthiest people. Fur was expensive, and by wearing it, you were communicating to everyone around you that you were powerful and untouchable. But not all medieval fashion was about extravagance. As we discussed earlier, religion played a significant role in shaping fashion. The church may have criticized the more excessive trends, but it also dictated much of the aesthetic of medieval clothing. Monks and nuns, for instance, wore simple, humble robes that were meant to reflect their devotion to spiritual life. These garments, often made from unadorned wool, were a sharp contrast to the extravagant styles worn by the nobility. And, in a sense, the religious attire symbolized a different type of power, a spiritual authority that was just as potent as the secular power wielded by the nobility. But while the clergy was meant to embrace humility, the wealthy elite were obsessed with displaying their opulence at every possible turn. The highly stylized doublets, fancy hats, elaborate collars, and even the exaggerated codpieces were all ways for the wealthy to advertise their success. Medieval nobles went to great lengths to ensure that their clothing was more lavish than anything the common folk could afford. This need to be noticed to stand out in a crowd drove the fashion trends that often bordered on the absurd. Perhaps one of the strangest and most symbolic fashion trends during the late Middle Ages was the use of armor as part of everyday clothing. As knights, lords, and royalty paraded through streets, plate armor wasn't just for battle, it was worn as a sign of prestige and military might. During tournaments and events, knights would wear full suits of armor, not just to show off their skill, but to signal their rank and their association with the chivalric code. But more importantly, armor became a fashion statement. The ornate designs and polished surfaces of plate armor were not only for protection, they were about displaying the wearer's wealth, craftsmanship, and status. It was armor as fashion worn not for practical defense, but as a visual declaration of power. And let's not forget that in the medieval period, it was not uncommon for wealthy men to commission decorative armor pieces like gauntlets, shoulder guards, and helmets purely for ceremonial purposes. These pieces didn't protect the wearer during actual battle, they were meant to impress onlookers and make a lasting statement about wealth and nobility. But the medieval period wasn't just about the elite. Fashion trends also found their way to everyday folk, though often in a more simplified form. It's fascinating to note how even peasants and commoners had their own way of participating in the fashion game. While they might not have had access to luxurious fabrics or extravagant accessories, they still found ways to express their identity and social status through clothing. Peasant women, for example, might wear simple dresses made from wool or linen, but they could accessorize with colorful headscarves, purses, and shoes. Peasant men wore simple tunics, but even they had the option of sporting embroidered designs or belt buckles that reflected their personality and rank within the lower class. However, no matter what class you belonged to, one thing was certain: fashion in the medieval world was a form of communication. The clothes you wore were a way of saying who you were, where you stood, and what you wanted the world to know about you. Whether you were a knight wearing an ornate suit of armor, a wealthy noble adorned in jewels and silk, or a peasant dressing in woolen layers, your clothing spoke louder than words ever could. It was a visual language that transcended the spoken word and was understood by everyone. As time moved on and the Renaissance began to emerge, fashion began to shift away from the extreme and extravagant trends of the Middle Ages toward a more naturalistic and human-centered approach. The towering hennons, the exaggerated codpieces, the excessive use of fur all began to fade as the ideals of proportion, balance, and individuality took hold. But even as fashion evolved, the legacy of the medieval period continued to influence the clothing and attitudes of future generations. In conclusion, medieval fashion wasn't just about clothes. It was about status, power, and identity. The extravagant garments, the ridiculous accessories, the ostentatious jewelry, everything had a purpose. Fashion was a tool, a method of communicating one's position in the hierarchy and demonstrating wealth and power. From the humblest peasant to the wealthiest king, what you wore told the world everything about you. It wasn't just about looking good, it was about asserting who you were in a society obsessed with visual cues and status symbols. And while we may laugh at some of the trends today, medieval fashion remains a fascinating window into a world that was built on power dynamics display and the visual language of clothing. As we bring our exploration of medieval fashion to a close, we should take a moment to reflect on one of the most curious aspects of the time: the obsession with fashion as a statement of power. From tightly laced bodices and padded shoulders to the iconic codpieces and pointed shoes, medieval fashion was not just about aesthetics. It was a direct reflection of a person's social standing, political allegiance, and often their personal ambition. The sheer complexity and, let's admit it, ridiculousness of medieval fashion trends highlight just how deeply intertwined fashion and identity were during this period. One of the most fascinating facets of medieval fashion was the gendered expression through clothing. It's easy to think of medieval clothing as a rigid, monolithic style, but in fact, there were significant differences between men's and women's fashion, particularly among the elite. Noble women's gowns were often marked by layers of fabric, with gowns designed to sweep across the floor in a train, while men's fashion took a slightly different direction, with an emphasis on tailored garments that accentuated the male physique. Men were keen on wearing tight-fitting doublets and hose, which often emphasized their chest and legs, creating a muscular silhouette that denoted strength and virility. Meanwhile, women's clothing, particularly in the earlier medieval period, was meant to cover more of the body, often incorporating wide sleeves and long trains that visually distinguished the wearers as delicate, graceful, and ornamental. Of course, both men and women in the medieval period had their own version of fashion extremes, but one of the most noticeable and often ridiculed aspects of women's medieval fashion was their use of tight lacing. Corsets became an essential garment for women in the late medieval and early Renaissance periods, and these garments were used not only to shape the body but to restrict movement. A woman's waist would be cinched in to such an extent that breathing, eating, and sitting became uncomfortable, if not impossible. But like the extravagant gowns and towering hennons, this restrictive fashion trend served as a status symbol showcasing the wearer's wealth and ability to maintain the appearance of physical delicacy. If you had a tiny waist, you were seen as refined, elegant, and in some ways delicate, as though you were so rich that you could afford to be physically constrained in such a way. But it wasn't just the clothing that made medieval fashion such a spectacle, it was also the accessories, as we've already touched on. Jewels were another major part of the fashion equation. But the jewels in the medieval period weren't the kind of small, subtle gems you might wear today. These jewels were huge, glistening, and often massive. Men and women alike adorned themselves with large, eye-catching jewels, which were usually sewn into the fabric of their clothing, or hung as ornaments from their accessories. In fact, it was common to see medieval nobility wearing multiple layers of necklaces, rings on every finger, and large brooches, all designed to showcase the wearer's wealth and status. The more jewels you wore, the wealthier you were perceived to be, and the more you had to show for your social rank. But don't let the jewelry fool you. Fashion wasn't just about aesthetics, it was also about symbolism. Certain colors, styles, and accessories were often used to communicate political or religious affiliation. For example, many kings and queens would wear a crown or diadem as part of their fashion ensemble, a clear signal of royalty. Similarly, noble families often wore family crests or heraldic devices sewn into their garments, so everyone would know exactly who they were and to which family line they belonged. It wasn't just a statement of wealth, it was a public declaration of identity, lineage, and power. Perhaps the most fascinating aspect of medieval fashion, though, is how the rise of fashion consciousness in the medieval period laid the groundwork for the future of Western fashion. As we've seen, clothing wasn't just about covering the body, it was a complex form of social communication. It was a visual language in which every stitch, every color, and every accessory had meaning. And as society grew more complex, so did the fashion trends. By the time we reach the High Middle Ages in the 12th and 13th centuries, we see a growing obsession with individuality. Fashion was no longer simply about conformity, it became about personal expression, or at least the expression of wealth and status. Nobles began to wear elaborate embroidered garments, luxurious furs, and imported fabrics that clearly separated them from the rest of the population. And while the peasants still wore simpler, more practical clothing, even they could find ways to show off their individuality, especially in the colors and styles of their headscarves, shoes, and belt buckles. By the 15th century, the focus on luxury fabrics, intricate embroidery, and customized accessories meant that fashion was no longer just about following the norms, it was about keeping up with the latest trends in a highly competitive society. The elite were constantly looking for ways to outdo each other in their fashion choices. The rise of the fashion market, along with the development of craft guilds and tailoring techniques, helped establish the foundation for what would eventually become the fashion industry we know today. In a way, medieval fashion was the beginning of modern fashion, a precursor to our obsession with luxury brands, iconic fashion houses, and designer labels. The individuality and visual display of power, wealth, and social standing that we see in medieval fashion trends set the stage for our modern-day preoccupation with fashion. Medieval fashion, though extreme and sometimes ridiculous by today's standards, reflected an ever-growing desire to communicate who we are through the clothes we wear. And as history marches forward, it's clear that the visual cues of identity in medieval times laid the groundwork for our fashion-conscious society. So, as we close the chapter on medieval fashion, remember that while these trends may seem absurd or impractical to us today, they were critical in defining the social structure, cultural values, and identities of those living in the medieval period. They were statements of power, wealth, and status, and in many ways they were the first steps toward the fashion-obsessed world we live in today. As we come to the final stages of our exploration into medieval fashion, it's important to step back and understand how the legacy of these bizarre, extravagant trends continues to influence the world of fashion today. Medieval clothing, while often seen as uncomfortable, outlandish, or even ridiculous, laid the foundations for many of the stylistic conventions that we still use in modern times. From the obsession with fabric quality to the use of clothing as a social marker, medieval fashion was an early reflection of the ways in which clothing can be much more than just a form of physical protection. It is a way to express identity and social status. While medieval fashion was primarily concerned with class distinctions and visual displays of power, it was also a precursor to the more personalized, individualistic styles that would eventually emerge in the Renaissance and beyond. If you look at today's fashion industry, especially in the world of luxury fashion, you'll see echoes of those medieval preoccupations with visual dominance. High-end fashion, whether it's haute couture or designer labels, is still about much more than just clothing. It's about making a statement, whether it's through the use of custom fabrics, exquisite embellishments, or distinctive cuts fashion. Today still carries the same underlying messages about wealth, power, and individual identity that were so prevalent in the medieval period. But what truly makes medieval fashion so fascinating is the way it reflects society. Throughout history, clothing has often mirrored the economic and political landscape of the time. Medieval fashion wasn't just a series of oddities for the sake of being strange, it was a direct product of a society that valued hierarchy and social visibility. The wider the sleeves, the longer the train, the bigger the codpiece, all of these were about communicating with the world. Fashion was a tool for nonverbal communication that transcended the spoken word. The development of sumptuary laws which tried to regulate who could wear what based on their social standing points, to the role clothing played in reinforcing social structures. These laws were meant to ensure that nobles remained separate from the common folk, to protect the elite's ability to project their status through their appearance. And in many ways, the desire to define oneself through fashion has continued into the modern world, albeit in more subtle forms. Today, we may no longer have sumptuary laws, but our desire to express ourselves through what we wear, whether it's designer labels or handcrafted vintage pieces, still ties back to that medieval obsession with identity and visibility. But while fashion today is still rooted in the same principles of visibility, modern trends have also moved towards individuality and personal expression in a way that medieval fashion didn't quite allow. During the Middle Ages, your clothing was largely dictated by your class and station in life. There was little room for personal choice or creativity in what you wore, especially if you were a member of the lower class. Fashion wasn't something you did for fun, it was something that served a functional and symbolic purpose. Today, however, clothing has become one of the most flexible ways to express personal identity. People wear clothes that make them feel confident, that express their values, and that reflect their individual stories. Despite the huge changes in the fashion landscape since the medieval period, some modern fashion trends are still strikingly reminiscent of medieval styles. Take the Gothic and Victorian-inspired clothing styles, for example. With their focus on dark colors, dramatic shapes, and excessive detail, these fashion trends echo the medieval aesthetic of exaggerated silhouettes, rich fabrics, and intricate embellishments. The corsets of the Victorian era, which were once seen as a symbol of both femininity and restriction, have a direct line back to the tight-laced bodices worn by medieval women. Even the modern love of luxury fabrics, silk velvet brocade, is something that finds its roots in the medieval period when those fabrics were reserved for the wealthiest. What's most interesting, though, is how fashion during the Middle Ages was so closely linked to religious ideas about modesty and humility. The church held significant sway over fashion, often decrying the excesses of the nobility's wardrobes. But rather than curbing the extravagant trends, the church often found ways to accommodate them. The religious iconography on medieval garments, particularly those worn by the clergy, served as a direct link to spiritual authority and was often used to visually separate the holy from the secular. In today's world, while religious fashion no longer holds the same sway over what people wear, spirituality and faith still influence fashion trends. Many people wear jewelry that has religious significance or garments that carry symbolic meaning. Whether it's through the cross necklaces worn by Christians or the prayer beads carried by Muslims, we can see how medieval fashion's symbolic significance persists in modern times. Perhaps the most striking comparison between medieval fashion and modern fashion is the continual tension between excess and restraint. In medieval society, there was a clear divide between those who could afford to indulge in excess and those who couldn't. Wealth and power were visually communicated through ornate jewelry, luxurious fabrics, and elaborate accessories. But this obsession with excess often clashed with the church's call for modesty. In modern fashion, we still see this conflict. Luxury and restraint often coexist. The rise of fast fashion, for example, shows how accessible clothing has become to all, while the luxury fashion market continues to showcase exclusivity and status. Today's fashion world might have moved beyond the strict class divisions of the medieval period, but the desire for status through clothing is still just as strong. By understanding medieval fashion as an expression of status and power, we see how clothing has always been a tool used to define, separate, and communicate. As strange and extravagant as it may seem to us today, medieval fashion was groundbreaking in its ability to use clothing as a form of social currency. And while the garments themselves may have changed the function of fashion expressing identity, status, and power, remains just as important today as it was in the Middle Ages. In conclusion, the bizarre, extravagant, and sometimes outlandish nature of medieval fashion was not simply a quirky anomaly, it was a crucial part of how medieval society defined itself. From the extravagant pointed shoes to the towering Hennen's fashion in the Middle Ages, was about far more than just appearance. It was about visibility and power. Today, we can still trace the roots of these medieval trends in the ways we use fashion to assert individual identity, cultural belonging, and social status. And while the specifics of the clothing may have changed, the role of fashion as a powerful tool of expression and communication remains just as relevant as ever. As we venture further into the legacy of medieval fashion, it's impossible not to touch upon one of the most intriguing aspects of this extravagant era: the connection between fashion and identity. Throughout history, and especially in the medieval period, what people wore was never just about personal style or comfort. It was an intentional, powerful, and visible form of self-expression. Fashion became a way for individuals to project their identity in a world where status, wealth, and power were often rigidly defined by social hierarchies. In the medieval world, identity wasn't something you could easily cultivate on your own. It was shaped by the family you were born into, the region you lived in, and most importantly, the social class you belonged to. Every element of your attire, from the fabric of your tunic to the pattern of your sleeves, was a statement about who you were, where you stood, and what you represented. This is especially evident when we look at how sumptuary laws played such a significant role in the fashion of the time. These laws were designed to regulate what individuals could wear based on their social rank. For example, a peasant might wear woolen tunics and plain shoes, while a nobleman could afford to wear the most elaborate silk garments, luxury furs, and gold-threaded embroidery. The law enforced a clear line between classes, and fashion became a tool to ensure that the boundaries of society were always visible. It's fascinating to note that the more extravagant the fashion, the more symbolic it became. The elaborate gowns, towering hennons, and embroidered codpieces weren't just about appearing fashionable, they were about claiming a place within the hierarchy. The rich fabrics, precious stones, and luxurious textiles that adorned the garments of the elite were meant to emphasize the great divide between the privileged few and the common masses, even in a time when individual expression wasn't always as free as it is today. Fashion offered an almost direct means of communicating social power. It's also worth mentioning that fashion played a significant role in social mobility, even if only symbolically. For instance, the wealthy merchant class during the late medieval period found ways to emulate the nobility through the clothes they wore. Although they may not have had the same hereditary titles as the aristocracy, the growing affluence of the merchant class gave them the means to wear luxurious fabrics and adopt the latest noble trends. The more they dressed like the upper class, the more they felt they could assimilate into a higher social strata. And while social mobility was still limited in many respects, the power of clothing as a means of creating a new identity was undeniably real. Interestingly, one of the most powerful symbols of status wasn't something you could wear, but something you could carry: accessories. Pouches, gloves, and belts were not just functional, they were deliberate, visible expressions of who you were. A nobleman's gloves might be embroidered with gold or adorned with precious gems, while a peasant's gloves were likely crafted from simple leather. Similarly, pouches worn by the elite were often constructed from fine silks, decorated with intricate patterns and lined with fur, while the working class carried simple leather pouches often used for storing coins or small tools. It's almost as if the pouch became a miniature canvas for displaying one's status. Consider the medieval pouch a precursor to the modern-day luxury accessory. Today's high-end fashion is full of luxury handbags, designer wallets, and premium accessories that are used not only for practicality, but also as a statement of wealth and style. In many ways, the medieval pouch functioned in the same way. It wasn't just about carrying personal items, it was about visually conveying wealth, power, and personal identity. Now, if we zoom out a bit and examine fashion as a performance, we begin to see a deeper layer to medieval fashion's role in society. In medieval times, public events such as feast tournaments and royal gatherings were grand spectacles, and the clothing worn by the elite at these events was designed to impress. Nobles would dress up for these occasions in elaborate garments that weren't just about personal taste. They were about performing their status for an audience. When knights participated in tournaments, they didn't just wear armor for protection. They wore ornate suits of armor that were decorated with crests, family insignias, and gold filigree signaling not just their fighting ability but their social rank. Likewise, royalty would host elaborate banquets and feasts where their clothing was often designed to demonstrate their power, influence, and wealth. Royal crowns, heavily embroidered robes, and expensive jewelry were worn deliberately to assert dominance and distinguish themselves from the rest of society. These public displays of wealth and power weren't just about vanity, they were about controlling public perception and ensuring that the nobility's authority was visually unassailable. But while fashion in the medieval world was often about social performance, it wasn't all about rich nobles and courtly displays. Peasant fashion also had its own symbolism, albeit more practical in nature. While peasants couldn't afford the luxury fabrics or elaborate designs of the aristocracy, their clothing still reflected their role in society. Simple tunics, woolen cloaks, and sturdy footwear were worn as functionality-driven uniforms for the working class, but even within this simplicity, there was still room for subtle expression. The patterns and colors of a peasant's attire could signal regional affiliations, and certain accessories like a headscarf or belt could express individuality. In a way, even modest peasant fashion served as a way to identify where you belonged in the grand social structure. And while medieval fashion might seem archaic to us now, The continuities between medieval trends and modern fashion are undeniable. Today, we still see fashion as a form of social performance, with clothing serving not only to protect the body but to project power, wealth, and individuality. Whether it's the luxury garments worn by the super rich or the personalized styles of the streetwear movement, fashion continues to be a way for people to construct their identities in a world that is, for all its modern conveniences, still obsessed with visibility and social distinction. As we wrap up this deep dive into medieval fashion, we must acknowledge that the bizarre, extravagant, and often uncomfortable styles of the medieval period weren't just the result of misplaced vanity. They were part of a larger social contract that used clothing as a tool for identifying and differentiating people based on their place in society. And while the clothing may have changed and the fabrics may have evolved, the underlying role of fashion as a means of personal expression and social performance has remained unchanged over the centuries. As we continue our journey through medieval fashion, let's take a moment to step into the complex world of fabric production, the true backbone of medieval fashion. Clothing was not just about what you wore, it was about where that fabric came from and how much effort went into its creation. Fashion, in many ways, was a representation of labor, the time and energy spent crafting every piece of fabric, stitching every seam, and adding every ornament. The materials used were not only a symbol of wealth and status, but also a reflection of how much work went into obtaining and producing them. One of the most coveted fabrics of the medieval period was silk, an incredibly luxurious material that had to be imported from the East. Silk was often reserved for the nobility, especially royalty, and its production was closely guarded. The long and arduous process of obtaining silk threads meant that only the wealthiest could afford it. Silk was not just a fabric, it was a symbol of global trade, exoticism, and luxury. Think of it as the medieval equivalent of high-end fashion today, the pinnacle of luxury. The process of creating silk began in the Far East, where silkworms produced the threads. These threads were carefully collected, spun into yarn, and dyed. The importation of silk, however, was not an easy or cheap endeavor. Traders traveled long distances along the Silk Road, battling harsh weather and dangerous conditions to bring silk to Europe. The value of silk was so great that its very presence signified wealth. If you could afford silk, you were not only rich, you were connected to a global network of trade and commerce. But while silk was the ultimate fabric of luxury, not everyone had access to it. Wool was the fabric of the common people, sturdy, practical, and relatively easy to come by. In fact, wool was the most widely used fabric throughout medieval Europe, and it made up the bulk of everyday clothing. Wool was produced locally, spun into yarn, and woven into cloth. The variety of wool was vast, ranging from coarse wool used for basic garments to finer wool reserved for the upper class. But unlike silk, wool was not a fabric that screamed exclusivity. It was simply functional and versatile, meant to keep the wearer warm through the harsh medieval winters. The wool trade was a massive industry during the medieval period. It was the backbone of European economies, especially in places like England and Flanders, which were major centers of wool production. Wool was so valuable that it was often used as a form of currency and trade. It was spun, dyed, and woven into fabric for tunic-style garments, coats, blankets, and shawls. The dyeing process itself was a huge industry. Dyeing wool could be as extravagant as the fabric itself, particularly when expensive dyes were used. Indigo, for example, was a rare and prized color. It came from the indigo plant, which was imported from distant lands, and its color ranged from deep blue to a rich purple. As with silk, indigo became a symbol of wealth, but only those who could afford the dye could truly showcase this luxury. The process of dyeing wool was labor-intensive, involving the careful extraction of dye from the plant, followed by an extensive and delicate process of coloring the wool. The rich colors of woolen garments, particularly the deep blues and purples, signified both opulence and power. And if you were wearing such a garment, you were clearly signaling your wealth to everyone around you. But wool wasn't the only fabric of note. The medieval period also saw the rise of brocade, a heavy silk fabric often embroidered with gold or silver threads. Brocade was used for special occasions, and only the wealthiest could afford to wear it. This fabric was rich, intricate, and often designed to display the family crest or emblem. If you could afford brocade, you weren't just wealthy, you were part of the elite, someone whose fashion spoke louder than words. Think of it as the modern equivalent of a bespoke designer dress, elaborate, custom made, and intended for only the most prestigious occasions. One of the defining features of medieval textiles was the complexity involved in their creation. The process was painstaking and involved spinning, weaving, dyeing, and embroidering the fabric. And while noble women were often tasked with the more refined aspects of weaving and embroidering, the men in medieval society were also heavily involved in the production of textiles, especially in the crafting of more durable fabrics for working-class garments. The loom, one of the most important pieces of medieval technology, was essential for the production of cloth. Looms, particularly the vertical loom, allowed weavers to create intricate patterns and designs that became essential in creating fine garments for the elite. Weaving became a skilled craft with the finest fabrics woven by the most talented artisans. And these fabrics weren't just for clothes. They were used to create tapestries, wall hangings, and decorative textiles that adorned the homes of the wealthy. In fact, tapestries themselves were a major status symbol in the medieval world. These tapestries were made of rich woolen fabrics, often woven with intricate designs of mythological stories, biblical themes, or heraldic symbols. Tapestries not only beautified the homes of the wealthy, but also served to demonstrate their status. They were often incredibly expensive, woven by skilled artisans who could dedicate months or even years to producing a single piece. They were a visual way of showcasing cultural refinement, and owning a large collection of tapestries was an indicator of great wealth and importance. But while luxury fabrics like silk, velvet, and brocade were associated with wealth, everyday clothing made from wool and linen was still essential for medieval society. It's important to note that while the wealthy wore the most extravagant fabrics, the common people were just as invested in the functionality and aesthetic of their garments, albeit with less access to high-end materials. Wool and linen were relatively easy to produce and were practical fabrics for daily life, offering warmth and durability in a world without modern conveniences. While they may not have had the intricate embroidery or luxury dyes of the aristocracy, their clothing still reflected personal style and regional identity. The connection between fabric and status in the medieval period was so strong that even fabric trade laws played a major role in how society operated. Certain fabrics were restricted to specific classes, with the upper classes monopolizing the finest materials such as silk and brocade. And while the lower classes often had to make do with rougher, more functional fabrics, they still found ways to create distinctive looks that reflected their own cultural identity. As we move beyond the medieval period, the influence of these fabrics and the complex textile production methods endured, helping to shape the Renaissance and modern fashion. The luxury fabrics, the dyeing techniques, and the intricate weaving methods all evolved into the fashion systems we see today. Though the materials have changed the concept of fashion as a social marker, A performance of identity and a symbol of status, has remained remarkably consistent throughout history. So next time you think about the luxury fabrics in modern fashion, or the textile techniques that go into making high-end clothing, remember that it all started with the painstaking craftsmanship of the medieval artisans. The silk, the wool, the brocade, and the tapestries were not just fashion statements. They were cultural touchstones that reflected an entire world of power trade and identity. And that legacy continues to shape the fashion world we live in today. As we conclude our deep dive into medieval fashion, it's essential to step back and understand how the medieval obsession with fashion and appearance shaped not only the social structure of the time, but also the psychological and cultural development of future generations. The grandiosity, the extravagance, and even the absurdity of medieval fashion were not just fleeting quirks of a bygone era, they were integral to the way medieval society was structured, the values it upheld, and how it interacted with the world around it. Medieval fashion, like much of medieval life, was deeply rooted in the symbolism of power. Clothing was not merely a means of covering the body, it was a language, a visual representation of status, rank, and affiliation. The aristocracy, the church, and the royalty all used fashion as a means of communicating their dominance and divinity, while the common folk were bound by strict rules of dress that reinforced their place in the social hierarchy. But while clothing as a marker of status played a significant role in medieval society, there was also a ritualistic and performative aspect to fashion. Just as the elaborate garments worn by nobles and royalty conveyed power, so too did the ceremonial significance of feasts, weddings, and tournaments, where fashion became a theatrical display of wealth, culture, and politics. These public performances allowed the medieval elite to further reinforce their status, but they also served to entrench social divisions and keep power dynamics in place. The ritualistic nature of fashion during medieval times can be seen in the way people dressed for religious occasions. The church played a central role in shaping both the morality and fashion of medieval Europe, encouraging a sense of humility while simultaneously sanctioning the display of religious wealth through elaborate vestments. Clergy and nobility alike wore clothing adorned with gold thread gemstones and religious iconography to demonstrate not only their piety but their devotion to their social and political roles. Monks, for example, often wore simple, humble robes that reflected their spiritual dedication, while bishops donned ceremonial garments that were more akin to regal vestments than anything resembling modest attire. This fascinating intersection of religion and fashion became even more evident as the medieval period progressed. Theological debates around the appropriateness of luxury and fashion gave rise to arguments about modesty, with church leaders offering both condemnation and justification for the lavish lifestyles of the wealthy. This ambiguity reflected the contradictory nature of medieval fashion. It was a means of asserting power, but it was also an expression of spiritual devotion, a duality that continued to affect future generations' understanding of clothing and identity. But beyond religious and ceremonial purposes, medieval fashion also had a profound impact on human relationships. The way people dressed influenced how they were perceived by others, particularly in courtly settings. Courtly love, the idealized form of love celebrated in medieval literature, often found expression in fashion. The tightly laced bodices, flowing gowns, and decorative accessories worn by women were meant to accentuate their beauty and elegance, while men used their elaborate doublets, furs, and rich fabrics to project chivalric strength and noble status. This display of wealth and physicality helped create an atmosphere of romantic longing, but also hierarchical separation. Love in the medieval context was often bound by social status and fashion, served to reinforce this invisible barrier. The importance of fashion in courtship and relationship dynamics cannot be overstated. The courtly aesthetic was all about ritualistic performance and symbolic gestures, whether through the clothes you wore, the way you presented yourself in public, or the manner in which you communicated with others. Fashion was a way to not only attract attention, but to also signal readiness for a life of affluence and honor, particularly for those seeking high marriage alliances. It wasn't enough to have wealth, you had to demonstrate it visually through the clothing you wore. But beyond the realm of the elite, there was also a subversive aspect to medieval fashion, one that revolved around clothing as a form of rebellion or even mockery. The fool's costume worn by jesters and entertainers is a perfect example of how medieval fashion sometimes pushed the boundaries of both style and social decorum. The jester's hat, with its floppy tails and bright colors, was not just a costume. It was a deliberate, ironic statement that allowed the wearer to speak truth to power in a society where the lower classes were silenced. Through fashion, the fool could express wit, irony, and criticism, all while technically adhering to the rules of the fashion system. What's truly fascinating is how fashion in medieval society continued to evolve. The medieval period, especially in the later years, began to reflect new ideas around individualism and personal identity. The Renaissance, which followed the medieval era, began to embrace a more humanistic approach to fashion, where clothing started to express personal taste and creativity rather than simply status and conformity. The preoccupation with luxury, though still prevalent, began to be replaced by an interest in balance and naturalism. The exaggerated shapes, the over-the-top accessories, and the symbolic colors of medieval fashion were gradually replaced by elegance and proportion. This transformation wasn't just about fashion styles, it was about cultural shifts. The medieval obsession with clothing as a display of status began to give way to a society that celebrated individual expression and personal achievement. And while we might look back at medieval fashion and laugh at some of its excesses, it is impossible to deny that the medieval approach to fashion laid the foundation for how we approach fashion today as a tool for communication, personal identity, and self-expression. As we wrap up this chapter of medieval fashion, it's important to acknowledge just how bizarre yet symbolically rich these trends were. From the extravagant pointed shoes to the codpieces that defied reason, medieval fashion was a spectacle, a performance of identity and power. But beyond the extravagance and absurdity, medieval fashion told the story of a society that placed immense value on visibility and hierarchy. The luxurious fabrics, the color-coded rules, the ostentatious accessories, all of it was meant to ensure that those who had power and wealth were always seen and admired, while those who didn't were forced to remain in the background, hidden from view. The legacy of medieval fashion continues to resonate in today's fashion world. The desire to stand out, to assert one's identity, and to display wealth remains a dominant force in modern fashion. While the medieval extremes have softened, the core ideas of status, visibility, and self-expression continue to shape the way we approach clothing. And as we reflect on this extraordinary period of history, it's clear that fashion is never just about clothing. It's about who we are, how we see ourselves, and how we want the world to see us. As we draw to a close in this examination of medieval fashion, it's time to reflect on how the traditions of status, display, and identity shaped not only the medieval era, but also set the stage for future fashion movements. Though centuries have passed, the obsession with clothing as an expression of power and social standing remains a hallmark of modern fashion culture. What is fascinating is that, despite the apparent absurdities of medieval trends, pointed shoes that defied common sense codpieces that often bordered on the ridiculous and towering hennons that were impractical at best. These were also the birth of modern fashion codes and visual displays of social identity. In a sense, medieval fashion laid the groundwork for our own relationship with clothing today. It was during this time that clothing began to take on a role beyond mere function, transforming from an article of utility to a visual statement. The rich fabrics, extravagant accessories, and bizarre trends, from the elaborate ruffs to furs draped with pride, were all part of an intricate system where fashion was used to assert dominance, to display one's wealth, and to signal one's position in society. But there is an undeniable truth about medieval fashion. For all its excesses, it wasn't just about vanity. Fashion had an intrinsic role in the medieval power structure. It wasn't about personal freedom or self-expression in the modern sense. It was about visibility and social visibility. What you wore told everyone around you exactly where you belonged in the complex medieval hierarchy. In this way, fashion became a kind of social shorthand, communicating status, affiliation, and even political intent without a single word spoken. The medieval hierarchy was much more rigid than the loosely defined social classes of today. The sumptuary laws that dictated who could wear what were meant to reinforce class divisions and ensure that the lower classes didn't infringe on the rights of the elite. However, as with all things related to the aristocracy, fashion also became a symbol of rebellion and defiance for the elite. By wearing excessively extravagant clothes, the nobility demonstrated their privilege and their ability to transcend the practical limitations of life, further cementing the divide between the upper and lower classes. The idea of exclusive fashion reserved for the aristocracy is something that has remained with us to this day. Luxury brands, for example, continue to operate on the same principle that medieval fashion did: the rarer, the more expensive, the more exclusive, the greater the value. This continues to inform modern-day perceptions of fashion, where the designer label has replaced the family crest, but the message remains the same. The higher the cost, the greater the prestige. Medieval fashion also had an interesting role in creating theatricality in daily life. The elaborate outfits worn by the aristocracy were performative in a way that would be difficult to imagine today. Whether it was the codpiece used to assert masculinity, or the hennin used to create a towering, almost divine silhouette, the clothing itself became part of the spectacle, transforming the wearer into a character in a larger public performance. This was fashion as performance art, where your clothes were not just for warmth, but to put on an act of visual show that communicated power, social standing, and sometimes even personality. This kind of performative identity construction through fashion has its echoes in contemporary life. Think about how we use fashion today, whether it's brands, personal styles, or subcultures, as a way to craft an identity. People still use clothing as a way to show where they fit in, what subgroup they belong to, or what message they wish to send to the world. Modern fashion in many ways still performs the same function that medieval fashion did. It is about visibility, social affiliation, and cultural display. Perhaps one of the most striking examples of how medieval fashion resonates today is seen in the persistence of luxury trends. Haute couture. The high-end fashion industry is built on the idea of creating exquisite garments that are meant to be worn by only the wealthiest and most powerful individuals, much like the silks and brocades reserved for royalty in the Middle Ages. Similarly, the prestige associated with high-end labels and the obsession with exclusivity is deeply rooted in the medieval past. The desire to create clothing that transcends mere utility and becomes a symbol of power and influence is a continuation of the same practices that governed medieval fashion. But even beyond luxury fashion, the cultural obsession with status and appearance has become more pervasive in today's world, particularly with the rise of social media. In the medieval period, your clothing was a way to tell the world who you were, where you stood in the social order, and what kind of power you wielded. Today, social media does the same thing using pictures, filters, and posts to curate identity, display status, and show off personal wealth. Your fashion, like in medieval times, becomes an extension of your identity and a tool of social influence. Another lasting influence of medieval fashion can be seen in the continued symbolism of certain materials and colors. Purple, once the exclusive color of emperors and kings, still carries a sense of royalty today, even if only in the form of a luxury handbag or a designer dress. Gold, silk, and fur, all symbols of wealth and luxury in medieval times, continue to be used as status markers in modern fashion. It's fascinating how these materials transcend time as they still evoke status and wealth, just as they did in the Middle Ages. But while medieval fashion was undoubtedly about visual dominance, luxury, and symbolism, it was also deeply rooted in a sense of ritual and ritualistic practice. The act of getting dressed in the morning was itself a kind of performance. Putting on the right garments wasn't just about staying warm or being fashionable, it was about assuming your social role and performing your place within the medieval social structure. And this is where the true legacy of medieval fashion lies. It was one of the earliest and most important forms of personal branding. It was not just about aesthetics, but about communicating the wearer's place in the world, their status, and their relationship to power. Medieval fashion set the stage for today's obsession with brand identities, individual expression, and the continual quest to stand out in a world that still revolves around social status and cultural capital. As we finish reflecting on these ancient practices and their continued influence today, it's clear that medieval fashion wasn't just about what people wore, it was about who they were, how they were seen, and how they wished to see themselves. The trends of the medieval period, with their luxurious fabrics, elaborate designs, and symbolic meaning, continue to shape our understanding of fashion as both self-expression and a reflection of power. As we continue to trace the roots of modern fashion back to the medieval period, it's crucial to consider the social context that made fashion such a significant part of medieval life. While we've discussed the extravagance of clothing and the symbolic nature of the garments worn by the aristocracy, we must also acknowledge how medieval fashion was profoundly influenced by economics, trade, and religion, as well as the emergence of urbanization and changing social roles. One of the key drivers of medieval fashion was the burgeoning trade network that connected Europe with the Middle East, Asia, and even parts of Africa. The Silk Road, which allowed for the exchange of goods, was instrumental in introducing new materials and fabrics to the West. Silk, for example, became a highly coveted fabric in Europe, prized for its texture and its connection to the exotic East. But the Silk Road wasn't just about luxury fabrics, it also facilitated the movement of dyes, spices, and jewelry, which in turn influenced medieval styles. The fabrics and colors that were once reserved for royalty slowly trickled down to the wealthy merchants, creating a new market for fashion that wasn't just limited to the traditional nobility. This shift in the consumer market was part of a larger economic change. As trade routes expanded, cities began to grow and the medieval world saw the rise of a new middle class, the merchants, craftsmen, and bankers who accumulated wealth through commerce. These rising middle classes now had access to materials and goods that were once reserved for the aristocracy, allowing them to embrace luxury and fashion in ways that had never been possible before. These wealthy merchants began to adopt fashion trends that were once exclusive to the nobility. They wore luxurious fabrics like silk and brocade, even though they lacked the noble lineage to justify such indulgence. And as a result, fashion began to democratize. It wasn't just about hereditary rank anymore, it was about who could afford the latest trends. This new market dynamic led to the explosion of fashion in urban centers, especially in cities like Florence, Venice, and Paris, where craftsmanship and luxury goods flourished. At the same time, the influence of religion over medieval fashion remained strong. The Catholic Church was an enormous force in the medieval world, not just as a spiritual authority, but also as a political and cultural force. The Church's influence on fashion is a curious one. On one hand, the Church preached modesty and humility, urging its followers to dress simply and avoid excessive adornment. On the other hand, the Church's leadership from bishops to cardinals to the Pope wore lavish robes adorned with gold and precious stones. The clergy's robes were often more elaborate than those worn by the royalty, and their vestments became a symbol of divine power, visually separating the spiritual from the earthly. This dual role of the church in shaping fashion created a unique tension in medieval society. While religious leaders wore ostentatious garments to assert their spiritual power, lay people were still expected to adhere to the church's teachings on modesty. For the nobility, fashion became a way to transcend these religious ideals by dressing in ways that not only showed wealth but also demonstrated their freedom from the constraints of religion. In a sense, the more exuberant the garments, the more the wearers were able to distance themselves from the moral restrictions of the church, placing themselves above both the earthly realm and the spiritual one. However, it's important to recognize that this conflict didn't just exist between the church and the elite. For the common people, fashion became a way to express community regional identity and craftsmanship. Clothing for peasants and workers often reflected local customs, family traditions, and social bonds. The colors and materials they wore were frequently dictated by what was available locally, yet these garments were still an important part of identity. Whether it was the woolen tunics worn by peasants or the functional shoes made of leather fashion in the lower classes, wasn't simply about looking presentable. It was about being part of a larger story, a story of community labor and belonging. As urbanization increased, the urban working class developed its own distinct style, sometimes practical, often colorful, and always indicative of their place in the world. Guild workers, for example, often wore clothes that reflected their trade and their position within the guild. A blacksmith, for instance, might wear leather aprons, while a weaver might wear a simple tunic with dyed wool. These garments weren't just practical for the workplace, they were a badge of identity, signaling to the world who the wearer was and what trade they were involved in. In the late medieval period, as the Renaissance began to take shape, we begin to see the first seeds of a shift toward individuality in fashion. The growing merchant class and the rise of the urban elite were the driving forces behind the development of fashion as a personal expression. Craftsmen and tradespeople began to invest in more personalized clothing, tailored to their own taste and preferences rather than simply adhering to the strict codes of fashion dictated by noble rank. The next step in this evolution came with the advent of the printing press, which allowed for the spread of fashion illustrations and textiles across Europe, further democratizing fashion. By the time the Renaissance took full hold in the 16th century, fashion had begun its transformation into the global industry we recognize today. Personal expression was no longer restricted to the wealthy elite. It was a way of life for people from all walks of life. And while the medieval period's rigid social distinctions began to soften the influence of medieval fashion, continued to permeate the fashion systems of the Renaissance, where the fabric embellishments and colors of medieval clothing would evolve into the refined luxury we associate with later periods. What is particularly fascinating is how medieval fashion continues to influence contemporary fashion trends. The silliness of medieval fashion, from pointed shoes to impractical codpieces, is often seen in today's experimental trends and avant-garde collections, where exaggerated proportions and bold statements are still celebrated. And though modesty is less of an issue today in high fashion, the notion of using clothing to convey status remains an ever-present part of the fashion conversation. From couture gowns to high-end accessories, the legacy of medieval fashion lives on, reminding us that what we wear is never just about comfort or style, it's always about how we present ourselves to the world. As we continue to delve deeper into the lasting impact of medieval fashion, it's important to recognize that fashion in the medieval period wasn't just a superficial trend. It was a reflection of the very fabric of society itself. What people wore, whether it was a lavish gown, an elaborate ruff, or a simple woolen tunic, was a direct reflection of the social, cultural, and political world around them. The clothing was more than just for warmth or practicality. It was a tool of communication, a visual language that conveyed who you were, where you stood, and what you represented in an era where social mobility was limited and identity was largely dictated by birthright. Medieval fashion served as social currency, a way for people to demonstrate their wealth status and loyalty to both their families and rulers. The patterns and materials used in garments were often highly symbolic, indicating not just personal taste but also family heritage and political affiliation. For example, the use of family crests, heraldic symbols, and religious motifs on garments tied individuals not only to their noble lineage but also to the greater narrative of the time, a society where nobility, religion, and political power were inextricably linked. One of the most interesting aspects of medieval fashion was the way in which the rising middle class, particularly wealthy merchants, sought to emulate the nobility. This trend reflected the changing economic landscape of Europe during the late medieval period. With the rise of commerce, trade, and banking, there was an increasing desire among the bourgeoisie to showcase their newfound wealth and social prestige through fashion. These merchants, although not part of the aristocracy, began adopting noble styles, buying luxurious fabrics and following fashion trends that had once been restricted to the elite. While this didn't change their social status on paper, it allowed them to claim a place within the visual hierarchy of medieval society. This emulation of noble fashion marked the beginning of a slow shift away from the strictly defined class-based fashion norms of the early medieval period. By the late Middle Ages, clothing had become a mark of individual expression. The rise of the merchant class and their ability to access the same luxurious materials meant that fashion was no longer strictly the domain of royalty and the elite. This access to luxury goods made fashion a more personal endeavor, with individuals now able to express their wealth and identity without needing to be born into nobility. But while the bourgeoisie sought to emulate the nobility themselves were not exempt from fashion's influence. As fashion became a means of status expression, it also began to play a role in political maneuvering. Monarchs, rulers, and aristocrats began using their wardrobe choices to communicate more than just wealth. They used it to assert power, project authority, and even challenge rivals. For example, kings might wear ornate crowns or elaborate robes adorned with symbols of divine right or military might, signaling their sovereignty and ability to control both land and people. The power of these visual cues made fashion a tool of governance, as monarchical legitimacy was often intertwined with the ability to appear above the common masses. Similarly, queens used their attire not only to display their wealth, but to make political statements about their status as consorts and mothers of heirs. This phenomenon was particularly evident during the medieval royal court, where fashion played a central role in courtly life. Court culture was dominated by ritual, and fashion was one of the most visible and significant ways to demonstrate loyalty to the ruling monarch. Courtly fashion was often designed not just to impress, but to signal political alliances, where a noble's choice of fabric or style could either affirm their allegiance or subtly defy the king's authority. It wasn't uncommon for rival factions at court to engage in fashion wars using the power of clothing, to assert dominance in a world where physical combat was not always an option. Interestingly, the symbolism in clothing extended beyond the noble courts into the world of religion, where sacred attire and religious vestments played a key role in both the visual and political authority of the church. The church was very much aware of how fashion could be used to reinforce its authority and message, and many of its leaders wore elaborate vestments adorned with gold thread, precious stones, and fine silks to signify their spiritual importance. These clerical garments were often embellished with biblical symbols or designs that reinforced the divine right of the clergy to lead and serve the people. In this way, medieval fashion was not just a political tool of the nobility and royalty, but also an essential element of religious power, with the church using clothing to create visual distinctions between the divine and the earthly. As the medieval period drew to a close and the Renaissance emerged, the relationship between fashion and identity evolved even further. The growth of individualism, which we associate with the Renaissance, meant that clothing no longer merely symbolized class or social power. It also became a means of self-expression. The personal style of kings, queens, and aristocrats began to take center stage. Fashion was no longer about adhering to strict codes of class conformity or representing a shared identity. Instead, it became about showing off the individual's unique status, whether that meant embracing bold colors, dramatic silhouettes, or innovative designs. This evolution from the medieval focus on class and hierarchy to the Renaissance celebration of individuality laid the foundation for the modern concept of fashion that prioritizes personal style and identity. Individuality and self-expression in fashion have been ingrained in culture ever since. But even today, many of the core principles established in the medieval period remain intact. The association between wealth and clothing, the idea that status is symbolized through attire, and the concept that fashion is a form of communication all still resonate today in the luxury fashion industry and even in the high street. As we conclude our deep dive into the bizarre yet fascinating world of medieval fashion, we can see how it was interwoven with the social fabric of medieval society. Fashion was never simply superficial. It was a critical tool for social distinction, personal identity, and political power. It helped create visual boundaries between the elite and the masses, between the clergy and the lay people, and even between nations and empires. But perhaps most importantly, medieval fashion set the stage for modern ideas of fashion as a means of self-expression and personal narrative. Today, fashion continues to be a way we use clothing to communicate who we are, where we stand in society, and what role we play in the larger global narrative. From luxury brands to street fashion, we still carry the echoes of medieval style materiality and symbolism into our wardrobes. Fashion, just like it was in the medieval period, is still a language, a way of communicating identity, culture, and power without ever having to say a word. As we approach the end of this exploration into the fascinating world of medieval fashion, it's important to consider how the visual spectacle of the time transcended not just the way people dressed, but how they lived, interacted, and viewed themselves in relation to society. Fashion in the medieval period was a lens through which you could interpret political power, religious affiliation, and social position. Today, although the sheer extravagance of medieval fashion has been tempered by the convenience of modern life, the core functions of status signaling and individual expression remain intact. We still use fashion today to convey messages about our identity and where we stand in the ever-evolving social hierarchy. In the medieval period, fashion was the most visual, immediate way of displaying your identity. Your clothing, your colors, the material you wore, these were all signifiers of who you were, what your role in society was, and what resources you had access to. To be seen in luxurious silks, velvet, or brocade was not simply an aesthetic choice, it was an assertion of power and prestige. Conversely, common folk wore woolen or linen garments that not only offered practicality but also marked their place in the social structure. These materials, though comfortable and practical for day-to-day life, were far from the visually striking designs of the aristocracy. Fashion during this time was also heavily influenced by a strong sense of cultural values and religious symbolism. The church, which played a central role in daily life, wielded a remarkable amount of power over fashion through the promotion of modesty and the enforcement of humble dress codes. While this message of humility was meant to influence the common folk, the church itself was not immune to the temptations of fashion. Clergy and high-ranking officials wore elaborate vestments designed to signal their spiritual authority, making it clear to the faithful that their position was one of both divine and earthly power. These vestments, with their intricate gold embroidery, precious gems, and rich fabrics, were a reflection of the church's immense wealth and its unquestionable dominance. But while the religious elite enjoyed the luxury of power, the rest of society had a more complicated relationship with the excessive nature of fashion. For many, fashion was an escape from the hardships of life, a way to feel connected to a world of grandeur and luxury that seemed out of reach. The rich could afford to don extravagant clothing to maintain their social hierarchy, but the common folk looked to these same garments with a sense of awe and aspiration. In many ways, fashion became an idealized representation of the world, as it could be a reflection of an almost dreamlike existence that contrasted sharply with the harsh realities of medieval life. One particularly interesting development that arose from this was the way fashion served as a cultural bridge between the elite and the masses. As mentioned earlier, the merchant class, wealthy but not noble, began to adopt the same trends that the nobility wore, creating a kind of fashion hybrid. Luxury fabrics once reserved for royalty began to be worn by these merchants who used fashion as a means to signify their growing economic power and influence. In this sense, fashion during the medieval period dissolved traditional class barriers, providing a visual language that could be understood and adopted across social divisions. And yet, despite this democratization of luxury fashion, the visual divide between the nobility and the commoners remained striking. Rulers, especially kings and queens, used clothing not only to express personal style but to assert their dominion over their subjects. Ornate robes and intricate accessories often served as a symbol of political might, reinforcing their divine right to rule. In fact, fashion in the medieval world was often directly tied to governance. Rulers would display their richest garments during ceremonial events to remind the people of their authority and power. Feast tournaments and processions were all opportunities for monarchs to visually reaffirm their position, using grandiose attire to ensure their continued dominance over both their subjects and their rivals. At the same time, fashion in the medieval period also offered a unique opportunity for subversion. The fool's costume worn by jesters is a perfect example of this. Jesters often seen as comedic figures who entertained royalty, and commoners alike wore clothes that mocked the excessive fashions of the nobility. The clashing colors, pointed hats, and bizarre accessories of the jester's attire were a deliberate reversal of the clothing worn by those in power, providing a form of subversive commentary on the social structures they existed within. In many ways, the fool's outfit was a reflection of medieval irony, where the outlandish fashion choices of the ruling class could be turned into a laughingstock, showing how fashion could simultaneously be a tool of dominance and mockery. This duality of fashion, its role as both a tool of power and a vehicle for subversion, is something that continues to resonate in today's world. Modern fashion, much like its medieval counterpart, still functions as a way to express social status, but it is also a vehicle for personal expression. From high fashion runways to streetwear, culture clothing still holds the power to signal identity, rebellion, and defiance. Just as the medieval period had its sumptuary laws which attempted to limit the use of certain fabrics to the elite, modern fashion still operates on a set of social rules, though these rules have evolved into the global market of designer goods and luxury fashion. However, unlike in the medieval world, where fashion was strictly about visibility and power, modern fashion provides more room for personal freedom. We no longer live in a world where class-based fashion codes dominate our wardrobes. Today, fashion is individualistic, allowing for the celebration of personal style, cultural diversity, and creativity. While wealth still plays a significant role in the fashion industry, there is now a greater emphasis on self-expression and individual choice. We see this in everything from custom clothing to the influence of social media on fashion trends. Yet, despite the personalization of today's fashion world, there's still a part of us that craves the ritualistic, symbolic aspects of clothing that were so deeply ingrained in medieval society. Medieval fashion was about ritual status and performance. And while the specifics have changed, many of those themes still influence the way we approach fashion today. Whether it's the luxury brands we wear or the streetwear we customize, fashion continues to serve as a way to reinforce social connections and project identity, just as it did in the medieval period. As we come to the end of this exploration, it's clear that medieval fashion was not merely a bizarre aesthetic. It was a social language, a way of defining identity and power. The medieval era may have ended, but the themes of visibility, status, and self-expression that defined fashion then are still at play today. Fashion in the end is as much about telling stories as it is about wearing clothes. Whether in the medieval court or on modern streets, we continue to use fashion to define who we are and to tell the world exactly what we want them to see. As we come to the closing stretch of our journey through medieval fashion, it's time to take a step back and look at one of the biggest takeaways from this deep dive into the world of medieval textiles, garments, and accessories: the undeniable intersection between fashion and culture. Medieval fashion wasn't just about adornment, it was a reflection of everything that society valued, feared, and aspired to. While today fashion has evolved into a personal form of expression, often centered around individual style and self-representation, medieval fashion was deeply entrenched in a collective identity that was shaped by class, religion, and politics. What was truly fascinating about medieval fashion was that it didn't just reflect the society that created it, it reinforced and maintained the rigid social structures that dominated life during that time. The aristocracy and clergy used clothing as a visual marker to separate themselves from the common folk. Those who could afford fine silks, brocades, and precious gems did so with the intent of communicating their superior position in society. They wore their clothing as a symbol of power, and power in medieval times was often as much about appearance as it was about real influence. The clothing of the medieval elite was not merely for personal pleasure, it was a performance and outward show of social dominance and divine favor. The act of dressing was a ritualistic process, reinforcing the visual distinctions between social classes. The sumptuary laws that regulated who could wear luxury fabrics, jewelry, and even certain colors helped maintain this visual hierarchy, ensuring that those at the top of the social pyramid had their status clearly marked by their extravagant attire, while the lower classes were restricted to more modest and functional garments. The role of religion in shaping fashion during this period cannot be overstated. The church was not just a spiritual authority, but also an economic and political powerhouse. As such, the clergy used their clothing to signal their divine connection, differentiating themselves from the secular nobility. The elaborate robes, embroidered vestments, and richly adorned symbols worn by bishops and monks spoke to the spiritual and temporal authority they wielded. However, the church's influence on fashion wasn't always as straightforward as just a visual display of authority. Religious ideals of modesty and humility often conflicted with the luxury displayed by the elite, creating a tension between the spiritual call for simplicity and the earthly desire for opulence. The very nature of fashion during the medieval period was intrinsically linked to visual power. Fashion, especially the extravagance and ornamentation of elite garments, was about defining authority. Kings and queens wore garments meant not only to show wealth, but to serve as visual proof of their right to rule. Regal clothing wasn't just fabric draped on a body, it was a symbol of divine right. A reminder to all who looked that the wearer was chosen by God to lead. Crowns, robes, and mantles were not simply accessories, they were symbols of sovereignty. The fabric itself, the fine velvet, satin, and silks, was often chosen to convey both divinity and dominance. This relationship between fashion and power wasn't exclusive to royalty. As we've already seen, the growing merchant class, wealthy and often politically astute, started to embrace luxury garments. These individuals, despite not holding noble titles, understood that appearance was a form of capital. By donning luxury fabrics and adopting noble trends, they were essentially performing status communicating that they too had the wealth to compete with the upper echelons of society. Medieval fashion was not about personal freedom, it was about visibility. It was a language of status and position, where the clothing a person wore conveyed who they were and where they stood in the complex social hierarchy. Fashion was not merely a reflection of individual choice, it was a social contract. And within that contract, certain rules governed what you could wear and, more importantly, what you could not. The rich could wear luxurious silk, satin, and velvet, while the common folk were relegated to more functional and modest clothing, such as woolen tunics and simple linen garments. But even with all the visual symbolism in place, fashion during the medieval period still had a walk sense of fluidity. As the medieval period came to an end and the Renaissance began to take hold, the role of fashion began to shift. The emphasis on class distinctions began to soften, and a greater focus on individual identity emerged. The merchant class, who once sought to emulate the nobility, began to develop their own sense of personal style, an early form of individual expression that laid the groundwork for the modern fashion world. The democratization of fashion that began with the middle class during the medieval period would over time lead to the global fashion industry we know today. Fashion is now more personal, more accessible and far less rigid than it was in the medieval era. It has become a form of self-expression that transcends social classes, though the symbolism of status is still embedded in what we wear. Luxury brands continue to thrive, often carrying with them the same visual markers of power that medieval fashion did: rich fabrics, custom designs, and exclusive products. Fashion today still serves as a means to communicate social standing, though now it also serves as a medium through which we assert personal identity. In this way, the medieval period may have been a time of extravagant and rigid fashion codes, but its legacy continues to influence how we view fashion status and self-expression today. The luxury market, with its carefully curated collections of high-end fabrics, exquisite designs, and tailored garments, still carries the same echoes of medieval performance, where what you wear defines how you are seen and understood in the eyes of others. Medieval fashion, for all its absurdities and impracticalities, played a key role in shaping the way we view the interplay of power, class, and identity through clothing. And while we might laugh at the pointed shoes, floppy hats, and excessive ruffs worn by the elite, we should recognize that the obsession with status and appearance that defined medieval fashion still holds true today. Fashion at its core is about much more than just clothing. It's about how we project who we are and what we value to the outside world. As we approach the final stretch of our deep dive into the eccentricities and complexities of medieval fashion, it's time to explore one of the most important aspects of fashion that has persisted through the ages: the relationship between fashion and power. Medieval fashion, with all its ridiculousness and extravagance, was at its core a visual language that served to reinforce social hierarchies. The garments of the time, with their intricate designs, expensive fabrics, and ostentatious embellishments, were not simply about aesthetic appeal. They were about power, status, and domination, both in society and in the broader political landscape. Throughout the medieval period, royalty and nobility used fashion as a tool to assert their authority. When a monarch wore a lavish crown, a flowing robe, and a fur-lined mantle, they were not simply dressing to impress. They were using clothing as a political statement, communicating to their subjects that their right to rule was both divine and inherent. Fashion allowed them to visually perform their power and ensure that their authority was not just acknowledged by their peers but felt by the masses. Take, for example, the royal coronation ceremonies that took place throughout the medieval period. The robes of kings and queens were designed to not only convey their divinity but also their dominance over the earthly realm. The use of gold thread, precious stones, and exotic fabrics made royal attire an unparalleled spectacle of wealth, authority, and power. The elaborate coronation robes were meant to be seen to project superiority and to ensure that the new ruler was immediately recognized as someone who belonged at the top of the social pyramid. But beyond the noble courts, the church was equally involved in the visual politics of fashion. The clerical vestments worn by bishops, abbots, and cardinals were often as lavish as the garments of the nobility. These religious leaders wore their ornate robes and richly adorned symbols as a way to demonstrate their spiritual authority, wealth, and divine right to guide the faithful. But the garments also served a political function. As the church wielded immense power during the medieval period, fashion became yet another tool in the battle for dominance between the secular and the spiritual. While medieval fashion was undeniably tied to power and authority, it also played an important role in reinforcing the status quo. The rigid class system of medieval society was enforced through visual distinction, with each social group clearly identifiable by the clothing they wore. The peasants and common folk, for example, were often relegated to simple woolen tunics and coarse cloth, reflecting their lower status. These garments, though practical for labor, were meant to convey that the wearer had no claim to the same social rank as those above them. For the aristocracy, fashion was a way of asserting their place at the top of this rigidly defined structure. Sumptuary laws that dictated what people could wear based on their social status, served as a mechanism for maintaining this visual hierarchy. These laws were meant to ensure that the wealthy classes remained visually distinct from the commoners, and that the lower classes did not try to impersonate the elite. However, while these laws restricted the types of clothing the common people could wear, they also contributed to the creation of a market for luxury fabrics and exquisite designs. The more opulent the fabric, the higher the status of the person wearing it. This connection between fashion and status goes far beyond the medieval period. In many ways, the obsession with class distinctions through clothing has influenced modern fashion systems. Today, we see similar visual cues in the luxury fashion industry, where the price of a garment and the brand associated with it can determine access to certain social spaces. Whether it's the exclusive design houses, the high-end accessories, or the custom-tailored suits, the underlying concept of using fashion as a visual status symbol has remained remarkably consistent. But it wasn't just the nobility and the clergy that used fashion as a way to assert power. The merchants, bankers, and traders of the medieval period also understood the power of fashion to communicate their newfound wealth and social mobility. The rising middle class sought to emulate the nobility, wearing luxurious fabrics and adopting the latest fashion trends. While they may not have had the same ancestral status as the aristocracy, their ability to access the same materials and styles allowed them to create their own sense of individuality and power. The middle class used fashion to perform their status, signaling to the world that they were no longer bound by their humble origins. What makes this so fascinating is that it was not only the wealthy who saw fashion as a political tool. In fact, even those in lower social positions could wield fashion as a form of resistance or subversion. The fool's costume worn by jesters and entertainers is a perfect example of how fashion could be used to undermine authority. The pointed hats, the bright colors, and the ridiculous proportions of the fool's attire were a visual statement that poked fun at the excesses of the elite. In this way, the fool's costume was both a symbol of comedy and a critique of the social order. In many ways, the subversive power of fashion has carried over into the modern world. Today, street fashion and alternative clothing styles often serve as visual rebellions against the mainstream and status quo. From punk fashion to gothic subcultures, fashion remains a powerful tool of resistance and self-expression. Whether through the use of bold colors, distressed fabrics, or unconventional silhouettes, individuals continue to use fashion to reject traditional norms and assert their personal identity in ways that challenge the dominant cultural forces. Ultimately, what we can learn from medieval fashion is the power of clothing to shape society, define power, and tell stories. The bizarre and extravagant trends of the medieval period weren't just frivolous displays of wealth. They were visual symbols of the complex relationships between class, political power, and religion. And even as fashion has evolved over the centuries, it still carries with it the same power to communicate who we are, where we stand, and what we value. As we conclude this in-depth exploration into the world of medieval fashion, let's take a step back and reflect on the lasting impact these historical trends have had on the modern understanding of clothing and self-expression. Medieval fashion, despite its sometimes ridiculous appearance, was a form of communication and not just a superficial display of wealth and status. It was a visual language that told the story of society's values, power structures and relationships to the divine, royal, and earthly realms. Even today, fashion continues to serve many of these same functions, communicating identity status and affiliation, albeit in more individualized ways. The way medieval clothing acted as social currency cannot be overstated. In those days, what you wore was an outward expression of your place in the world. Luxurious materials and elaborate designs were reserved for the wealthiest individuals, while those in lower classes adhered to stricter and more modest dress codes. This served not only to reinforce class divisions, but also to define the limits of one's social mobility. Fashion was as much about who you couldn't be as it was about who you were. But interestingly, the merchant class's adoption of noble fashions began to blur these lines, showcasing how clothing had the power to shift identities and influence social dynamics. In many ways, we see echoes of this in the luxury fashion market of today. The high-end clothing industry, with its exclusive designs, premium fabrics, and luxurious accessories, still operates as a way for individuals to project power and status. As in the medieval period, we continue to use fashion as a way to communicate wealth, but now this communication is not just about royalty or noble birth. It is also about cultural capital. Fashion has evolved from being a simple mark of aristocratic power to being a globalized expression of wealth and influence available not just to the elite, but to anyone with the means to engage in this visual language. Yet, as much as fashion is about luxury and status, it also continues to function as a means of self-expression. This was one of the key lessons from the medieval period. Fashion was never just about following trends. It was about communicating one's place in the world. Today, fashion continues to serve this purpose, albeit with more individualistic freedom. Whether through customized outfits, personalized streetwear, or avant-garde designer collections, we still see people using their clothes to communicate their identity values and political affiliation. Fashion's role in challenging social norms and creating visual commentary is just as relevant today as it was in medieval times. From punk fashion to social media, influencers' fashion has become a tool for rebellion, a way to disrupt conventional standards and express individuality. The fool's costume worn by jesters to mock the elite has evolved into the counterculture movements we see today. And while the nobility of the medieval period used clothing to assert dominance, the modern fashion world uses style to assert resistance against authority. As we see in street fashion, or even the rise of eco-conscious clothing brands that challenge the excesses of the fast fashion industry, what's particularly striking, though, is how medieval fashion helped shape the rituals surrounding clothing that have continued into the modern era. The act of dressing up for ceremonies, banquets, and public appearances was not just about self-presentation. It was about creating a ritualistic experience in which identity could be performed and reaffirmed. This ritualistic aspect of fashion persists today in the form of formal events like red carpet awards, weddings, and political events, where the clothing choices of the participants are often as meaningful as the words they speak. Today, we still dress for public appearances as a way to perform identity, to communicate through visual cues who we are, who we align with, and where we stand. Fashion, therefore, remains as much a social performance as it ever was. Whether through the luxury of the elite, the creativity of artists, or the rebellion of subcultures, it's clear that clothing is more than just fabric, it is a language. Like in the medieval period, we use fashion to communicate identity, but now we do so in a diverse and multifaceted way. Fashion today is about self-expression and individuality, but it still holds the power to influence society, politics, and culture in the same ways it did centuries ago. The medieval period's obsession with fashion and identity through clothing was the starting point for many of the trends we see today. Whether in the way noble classes once displayed their dominance through elaborate garments, or how the middle classes began to embrace the luxury of the aristocracy, fashion has always been a vehicle for communication. The way people dressed in the medieval period served to define not only social position, but also personal narrative and cultural belonging. In today's world, the luxury fashion market and streetwear subcultures continue to reflect this battle for visibility and self-definition. Whether it's the richer-than-thou couture of the modern elite or the DIY ethos of punk fashion, the core principles of status power and individual expression remain just as relevant and vibrant as they were in the medieval world. So the next time you slip on a jacket tie, a scarf, or choose an outfit for a night out, think about the medieval people who lived hundreds of years ago and how their fashion choices spoke volumes about their place in society. In many ways, fashion remains timeless. It still tells us who we are, where we stand, and what story we wish to tell. From medieval court to modern catwalk, fashion has always been a tool of storytelling, helping us weave our identity into the fabric of history itself. It seems we have reached the conclusion of the story. I hope you've enjoyed the deep dive into the world of medieval fashion and how it connects to modern-day clothing trends and expressions. If you'd like, I can help with anything else, whether continuing this journey in a different area of history, discussing fashion's modern impact, or any other topic you'd like to explore. Wherever you are, I hope tonight brings you rest, comfort, and maybe a curious dream or two.